The ancient city of Corinth, perched strategically on the narrow isthmus connecting the Peloponnese to mainland Greece, served as the birthplace of one of mythology's most complex heroes. During the late Bronze Age, this commercial powerhouse commanded both the Saronic and Corinthian Gulfs, its twin harbours facilitating trade routes that stretched across the Mediterranean. Within the walls of Corinth's Acropolis, known as Acrocorinth, the royal palace housed a lineage that would produce both legendary sinners and celebrated heroes. King Glaucus ruled Corinth during this period of prosperity and maritime dominance. As the son of the infamous Sisyphus, Glaucus inherited not only the throne but also the complex legacy of his father's cunning and divine transgressions. Sisyphus, remembered primarily for his eternal punishment of rolling a boulder up a mountain in the underworld, had been one of the most notorious figures in Greek mythology for his attempts to cheat death itself. This grandfather's reputation for cleverness and defiance of divine will would cast a long shadow over the royal house, influencing the character and destiny of future generations. The birth of Glaucus's son occurred amid circumstances that would later fuel competing narratives about the child's true parentage. Official court records and genealogical traditions maintained that the infant, initially named Hipponos, was the legitimate heir to the Corinthian throne through his father Glaucus. The name Hipponos, meaning horse-minded or one who thinks of horses, reflected the family's deep connection to equestrian pursuits and their reputation for breeding the finest horses in the Greek world. Corinthian horses were renowned throughout the Mediterranean for their speed, endurance, and intelligence, making them highly sought after by warriors and charioteers alike. However, alternative genealogical accounts emerged that challenged this straightforward royal lineage. These competing narratives claimed that Poseidon, the earth-shaker and lord of horses, was the boy's actual father. Such divine paternity claims were not uncommon in Greek heroic tradition, serving multiple purposes within the cultural and religious framework of ancient society. Divine parentage elevated heroes above ordinary mortals, explaining their extraordinary abilities and justifying their remarkable deeds. More importantly, it provided a theological explanation for capabilities that exceeded normal human limitations. The assertion of Poseidon's paternity carried particular significance given the god's association with horses and the sea, both elements that would feature prominently in Hipponos's later adventures. Poseidon's domain encompassed not only the oceans and earthquakes, but also horses, which the Greeks believed he had created. This divine connection would manifest in the young prince's natural affinity for these magnificent creatures and his eventual mastery of Pegasus, the winged horse born from Medusa's blood. The political implications of these competing genealogies extended beyond mere family history. In ancient Greek society, legitimate royal succession depended heavily on clear paternal lineage. However, claims of divine parentage could supersede traditional inheritance patterns, providing alternative sources of authority and legitimacy. The tension between mortal and divine parentage in Hipponos's case reflected broader themes in Greek culture about the relationship between human ambition and divine will. Corinthian society during Hipponos's youth was characterized by its commercial orientation and cosmopolitan character. The city's strategic location made it a natural hub for merchants, craftsmen, and travelers from across the known world. The royal court regularly hosted delegations from distant lands, exposing the young prince to diverse cultures, languages, and customs. This international exposure would prove invaluable in his later travels and adventures, providing him with the cultural sophistication necessary to navigate foreign courts and customs. The economic foundation of Corinth rested on its control of trade routes between the eastern and western Mediterranean. Merchants transported goods across the narrow isthmus, rather than risk the dangerous journey around the Peloponnese, paying substantial fees to the Corinthian crown for this privilege. This revenue stream allowed the royal family to maintain a lavish court and invest heavily in military capabilities, including the finest horses and most skilled warriors available. Within this environment of wealth and international commerce, young Hipponas received an education befitting his royal status. His tutors included not only local scholars, but also foreign experts in various fields of knowledge. Military training formed a central component of his education, with particular emphasis on horsemanship and the use of weapons from horseback. The prince demonstrated exceptional natural ability in these pursuits, displaying an almost supernatural connection with horses that lent credence to claims of his divine parentage. The circumstances that led to his transformation from Prince Hipponas to Bellerophon, slayer of Belleros, remain shrouded in conflicting accounts and deliberate obscurity. What historical sources agree upon is that the incident involved the death of a man named Belleros, though the exact nature of this individual and the circumstances of his demise vary significantly between different versions of the story. Some accounts describe Belleros as a Corinthian nobleman who challenged the prince's authority or honour in some unspecified manner. Others suggest he was a foreign visitor to the court who committed some offence against royal protocol or divine law. The most detailed versions paint Belleros as either a political rival seeking to undermine Glaucus's rule, or a suitor competing for the hand of a noble maiden whom Hipponas also desired. The killing itself appears to have been neither premeditated murder nor accidental homicide, but rather the result of a formal combat or duel conducted according to established customs. Ancient Greek society recognized various forms of ritualized violence as legitimate means of resolving disputes, particularly among the aristocratic class. These encounters, while potentially fatal, were governed by strict protocols that distinguished them from common murder or assault. The aftermath of Belleros's death created a complex legal and religious situation that would fundamentally alter the prince's life trajectory. Under Greek law and custom, even justified homicide required purification rituals and often temporary or permanent exile from one's homeland. The pollution associated with taking human life, regardless of circumstances, demanded cleansing through appropriate religious ceremonies conducted by qualified priests or foreign rulers. This requirement for purification would soon force the newly named Bellerophon to leave Corinth, beginning the series of adventures that would establish his reputation as one of Greece's greatest heroes. The transformation from Prince Hipponas to Bellerophon, the exile, marked not just a change in name and status, but a fundamental shift in his relationship with both mortal society and divine providence. The political landscape of Corinth during this period was complicated by the city's growing influence and the corresponding jealousy of neighbouring powers. Athens, Sparta, and Thebes all viewed Corinthian commercial success with suspicion, while smaller city-states either sought alliance or plotted conquest. King Glaucus navigated these treacherous diplomatic waters through a combination of military strength, economic leverage, and strategic marriages among the aristocratic families of different regions. The royal court itself was a microcosm of these broader political tensions, with various noble families competing for influence and favour. Foreign ambassadors, merchant princes, and military commanders from allied cities maintained permanent residences in Corinth, creating a complex web of international relationships that young Bellerophon observed and learned to navigate. This early exposure to high-level diplomacy and intrigue would serve him well in his later encounters with foreign rulers and their courts. The religious atmosphere of Corinth during Bellerophon's youth reflected the city's commercial character and international connections. While maintaining traditional Greek religious observances, the city also welcomed foreign deities and mystery cults that appealed to its diverse population. The Temple of Aphrodite on Acrocorinth was particularly famous throughout the Greek world, attracting pilgrims and visitors who contributed significantly to the city's economy. The transformation from Prince Hipponas to Bellerophon occurred on a spring morning when the Corinthian agora bustled with merchants preparing for the seasonal trading expeditions. The incident that would forever alter the young prince's destiny involved either his brother Deliades, according to some sources, or a prominent Corinthian citizen named Belleros, depending on which genealogical tradition one follows. The confusion in ancient sources reflects the deliberate obscurity that often surrounded cases of aristocratic homicide, where political considerations frequently influenced how events were recorded and remembered. The most detailed account, preserved in fragments from the lost epic Bellerophon, describes the victim as Deliades, Hipponus's younger brother by 3 years. Deliades had earned a reputation throughout Corinth for his exceptional skill in wrestling and boxing, regularly defeating competitors from visiting delegations in allied cities. His athletic prowess had made him a favourite among the common people, who gathered in large crowds to watch him train in the gymnasium adjacent to the royal palace. The brothers maintained a competitive but affectionate relationship, often engaging in friendly contests that drew spectators from across the city. On the morning in question, the brothers had arranged to demonstrate a new fighting technique that Hipponus claimed to have learned from a Spartan warrior visiting the court. The demonstration was to take place in the palace courtyard, with several dozen courtiers and foreign dignitaries in attendance. The technique involved a complex series of grappling moves designed to quickly disable an opponent without causing permanent injury, making it particularly valuable for subduing prisoners or settling disputes without bloodshed. The initial phases of the demonstration proceeded as planned, with both brothers executing the prescribed movements with the fluid precision expected of royal princes trained by the finest instructors available. Hipponus successfully demonstrated the defensive aspects of the technique, showing how to counter various attacks and maintain balance under pressure. The assembled audience murmured appreciatively at the display of skill, with several foreign ambassadors taking detailed notes for later transmission to their own military commanders. The fatal moment occurred during the final phase of the demonstration, when Hipponus attempted to show how the technique could be used to throw a larger opponent. The maneuver required precise timing and careful control of force, as the defender used the attacker's momentum against him while maintaining a secure grip on specific pressure points. Deliades, playing the role of the attacker, launched himself forward with perhaps more enthusiasm than the technique required, seeking to provide a realistic challenge for his older brother. The combination of Deliades' aggressive approach and Hipponus' application of excessive force created a catastrophic result. Instead of the controlled throw that should have deposited Deliades safely on the ground, the prince found himself hurled backward with tremendous velocity. His head struck the marble edge of a decorative fountain with a sound that witnesses later described as resembling the crack of a bronze shield splitting under a heavy blow. The impact was so severe that Deliades died instantly, his neck broken and skull fractured beyond any possibility of survival. Alternative versions of the incident, found primarily in Corinthian historical records compiled during the Roman period, identify the victim as Belleros, a wealthy merchant who had gained citizenship through his extensive contributions to the city's defensive fortifications. According to these accounts, Belleros had publicly questioned the legitimacy of certain royal trade monopolies, arguing that they violated traditional Corinthian commercial law and discriminated against naturalized citizens in favour of hereditary nobles. The confrontation between Hipponus and Belleros allegedly took place in the commercial quarter of the city, where the merchant maintained his primary warehouse and offices. Belleros had been addressing a gathering of fellow merchants and craftsmen, explaining his legal position and encouraging others to petition the royal council for reform of existing trade regulations. His arguments were well-reasoned and supported by precedent from other Greek cities, making them potentially dangerous to royal prerogatives. Hipponus arrived at the scene accompanied by several members of his personal guard, ostensibly to hear Belleros's concerns and respond to them in a manner befitting royal dignity. However, the prince's youth and inexperience in handling political dissent led him to interpret the merchant's legal arguments as personal insults to his family's honour. When Belleros refused to withdraw his petition and continued to cite legal precedents that challenged royal authority, Hipponus struck him with the pommel of his sword. The blow, intended to humiliate rather than injure, caught Bellerophon off balance as he turned to address another questioner in the crowd. He fell backward into a stack of bronze ingots that had been unloaded from a recently arrived ship, the metal edges crushing his chest and puncturing vital organs. Like Deliades in the alternative account, Bellerophon died almost immediately from his injuries, his blood spreading across the warehouse floor as horrified witnesses looked on. Regardless of which version accurately describes the events, the immediate aftermath created an identical crisis for the young prince. The concept of blood guilt, known in Greek as miasma, represented one of the most serious forms of spiritual contamination recognized in ancient religious practice. This pollution was believed to emanate from any act of homicide, whether intentional or accidental, justified or criminal. The contamination affected not only the killer but potentially his entire family and community if proper purification rituals were not performed. Greek religious thought conceived of miasma as a tangible spiritual substance that clung to the guilty party and everything he touched. This contamination could spread through contact, making the unpurified killer dangerous to anyone who interacted with him. The pollution was believed to anger the gods, particularly the Furies, who would pursue the guilty party with relentless vengeance until proper expiation was achieved. Cities that harboured unpurified killers risked divine wrath in the form of plagues, famines, earthquakes, or military defeats. The theological basis for blood guilt rested on the belief that human life was sacred to the gods, particularly Zeus in his role as protector of justice and social order. Taking a life, even accidentally, disrupted the cosmic balance and created a debt that had to be repaid through appropriate rituals and penalties. The severity of the contamination was believed to correspond to the circumstances of the killing, with premeditated murder creating more severe pollution than accidental homicide. But even the most justified killing required some form of purification. The social implications of miasma were equally serious, as the contaminated individual became effectively ostracized from normal community life. He could not participate in religious ceremonies, enter temples, or engage in the normal social and commercial activities that defined citizenship in a Greek polis. Family members and close associates might also be considered contaminated through association, creating pressure for the guilty party to seek purification quickly or face complete social isolation. The purification process for homicide was complex and varied, depending on the specific circumstances and the customs of different regions. Generally, it required the killer to seek absolution from a foreign ruler who possessed the religious authority to perform the necessary rituals. This requirement for foreign purification served multiple purposes. It removed the contaminated individual from his home community, preventing the spread of pollution. It acknowledged that local authorities might be compromised by personal or political relationships. And it demonstrated proper humility by requiring the guilty party to submit to foreign judgment. King Glaucus faced an impossible situation following his son's killing of either Deliades or Bellerophon. As both father and ruler, he was torn between natural parental affection and his duty to maintain divine favour for his kingdom. Corinthian priests consulted ancient texts and performed divination rituals to determine the proper course of action, while representatives from allied cities watched carefully to see how the crisis would be resolved. The religious authorities unanimously concluded that Hipponas had indeed incurred blood guilt, regardless of his intentions or the circumstances surrounding the death. The contamination was considered so severe that his continued presence in Corinth threatened to bring divine punishment upon the entire city. Several priests reported disturbing omens in their daily sacrifices, including abnormally coloured flames, animals that refused to approach altars, and wine that turned sour in sacred vessels. The political ramifications of the situation were equally serious, as various factions within the court began positioning themselves to take advantage of the crisis. Some nobles argued that the incident proved divine displeasure with Glaucus's rule, and suggested that a change in leadership might be necessary to restore cosmic balance. Others maintained that the killing was justified under traditional aristocratic codes of honour and that any punishment would set a dangerous precedent for future conflicts among the nobility. Foreign observers were particularly interested in how Corinth would handle the situation, as the city's response would influence diplomatic relationships throughout the region. Athens had recently dealt with a similar case involving a nobleman who accidentally killed a slave during a religious festival, and their handling of the purification process had been widely praised for its adherence to traditional protocols. Sparta, characteristically, had taken a more pragmatic approach to a comparable incident, focusing on the political and military implications rather than religious considerations. The decision to send Hipponus into exile was ultimately made by a council consisting of King Glaucus, the city's chief priest, and representatives from the most prominent noble families. The exile would serve multiple purposes: removing the source of contamination from Corinth, demonstrating proper respect for divine law, and providing an opportunity for the prince to seek purification from a foreign ruler with the necessary religious authority. The choice of destination for the exile required careful consideration of both religious and political factors. The foreign ruler selected to perform the purification had to be someone with unquestionable religious authority, sufficient political independence to render impartial judgment, and the diplomatic standing to ensure that his decision would be respected throughout the Greek world. After extensive consultation with oracles and diplomatic advisors, the council selected King Pretus of Tiryns as the most appropriate choice. Pretus ruled one of the most ancient and respected kingdoms in the Argolid, with genealogical connections to the legendary heroes of earlier generations. His capital city of Tiryns boasted massive cyclopean walls that were considered among the greatest architectural achievements in Greece, while his court maintained strict adherence to traditional religious practices that made him an ideal choice for conducting purification rituals. Additionally, Pretus had no direct political conflicts with Corinth, ensuring that his judgment would not be influenced by immediate strategic considerations. The journey from Corinth to Tiryns would take the exiled prince through some of the most historically significant territory in Greece, passing near Mycenae, Argos, and other centres of Bronze Age civilization. This route would provide Hipponus with ample time to contemplate his situation and prepare mentally for the challenges that lay ahead. The physical journey of approximately 60 miles would be accomplished on foot, as tradition required that those seeking purification approach their destination in a state of humility and penance. Before departing Corinth, Hipponus underwent preliminary purification rituals designed to prevent the spread of contamination during his journey. These ceremonies, conducted by the city's chief priest in a sacred grove outside the main gates, involved ritual washing with water from 7 different springs, the burning of specific herbs and incense, and the recitation of ancient formulas requesting divine protection for travellers. The prince was required to wear simple clothing made from undyed wool and to carry only basic supplies for the journey ahead. The transformation from Prince Hipponus to Bellerophon was formally acknowledged during these departure ceremonies, as the name change symbolically represented his separation from his former life and status. The new name, meaning Slayer of Belleros, would serve as a permanent reminder of the incident that had altered his destiny, while also acknowledging the reality of what had occurred rather than attempting to minimize or disguise it. The massive bronze gates of Tiryns opened before the travel-worn figure of Bellerophon as he approached the ancient citadel on a dusty afternoon in late summer. The cyclopean walls, constructed from limestone blocks so enormous that later generations would attribute their placement to divine intervention, cast deep shadows across the narrow approach road. These fortifications, built during the height of Mycenaean civilization, had withstood sieges, earthquakes, and the passage of centuries, their weathered surfaces bearing testament to the enduring power of the Argolid's ruling dynasty. King Pretus received the exiled Corinthian prince in the great hall of his palace, a vast chamber supported by columns carved from single blocks of marble and decorated with frescoes depicting the legendary deeds of previous rulers. The king himself was a man in his middle years, his beard streaked with silver and his bearing marked by the dignity that came from ruling one of Greece's most ancient kingdoms. Beside him sat Queen Sthenobia, known in some regions as Antaea, whose beauty had become legendary throughout the Peloponnese, and whose political acumen had significantly enhanced her husband's diplomatic influence. Sthenobia possessed the kind of beauty that inspired poets and troubled the sleep of visiting diplomats. Her dark hair was arranged in elaborate braids woven with gold threads, while her chiton of finest Sidonian purple was fastened with brooches of worked silver depicting scenes from the adventures of Perseus. Her eyes, described by contemporary sources as having the depth of winter seas, seemed to assess and catalogue every person who entered her presence. At approximately 25 years of age, she had already earned a reputation for intelligence that matched her physical attractiveness, serving as her husband's most trusted advisor in matters requiring diplomatic finesse. The Queen's background added complexity to her position at the Corinthian court. She was the daughter of Ariobates, king of Lycia, a powerful realm in Asia Minor that controlled crucial trade routes between Greece and the wealthy kingdoms of the eastern Mediterranean. Her marriage to Pretus had been arranged to cement an alliance that provided Tyrrhens with access to Lycian markets, while offering Iobates a reliable ally in Greek affairs. This international connection gave Sthenobia perspectives and contacts that extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of Argolid politics. The purification ceremony for Bellerophon followed ancient protocols that had been established during the earliest periods of Greek religious practice. Pretus, as the presiding authority, conducted rituals involving the sacrifice of a white bull to Zeus Catharsios, the aspect of the supreme deity responsible for cleansing blood guilt. The ceremony took place at dawn in a sacred grove outside the city walls, where a spring of pure water flowed from beneath an ancient oak tree sacred to the god. Bellerophon was required to bathe in this spring while priests recited formulas in archaic Greek dialects that predated the classical language by several centuries. The religious aspects of the purification extended over several days, during which Bellerophon remained in ritual isolation within a specially prepared chamber of the palace. This room, traditionally used for such purposes, contained no metal objects that might interfere with the cleansing process, while its walls were decorated with painted scenes depicting the successful purification of previous suppliants. During this period, the prince consumed only bread, honey and water drawn from the sacred spring, while priests performed daily sacrifices to ensure divine approval of the proceedings. Following the completion of his purification, Bellerophon was formally welcomed as a guest of the royal household, entitled to all the protections and privileges accorded to those under the sacred bonds of Xenia. This institution of guest friendship represented one of the most fundamental concepts in Greek social organization, creating reciprocal obligations between host and guest that were considered inviolable under divine law. Zeus Xenios, the protector of guests and hosts, was believed to punish violations of these obligations with particular severity, making Xenia one of the most reliable safeguards for travellers in the ancient world. The obligations of Xenia extended far beyond simple hospitality, encompassing a complex web of mutual responsibilities that could persist across generations. Hosts were required to provide food, shelter, and protection to their guests, while guests were expected to respect their host's property, customs, and family members. The relationship was considered sacred, with violations potentially bringing divine wrath upon both parties and their descendants. For Bellerophon, acceptance into Pretus's household under these terms meant that he was effectively under the protection of both royal authority and divine law. The Palace of Tyrrhens during this period functioned as a complex social environment where representatives from various Greek cities and foreign kingdoms maintained semi-permanent residences. Ambassadors from Athens, Sparta, Thebes, and numerous smaller palaes conducted ongoing negotiations regarding trade agreements, military alliances, and territorial disputes. The presence of these diplomats created a sophisticated court culture where political intelligence, cultural knowledge, and personal connections were as valuable as military prowess or economic resources. Sthenoboia's role within this diplomatic community extended far beyond that of a traditional royal consort. Her Lycian heritage provided her with unique insights into Asian politics and economics, while her intelligence and education made her an invaluable advisor to her husband on matters requiring cultural sensitivity. Foreign ambassadors frequently sought private audiences with the Queen, recognizing that her influence over Pretus often determined the success or failure of their missions. This political prominence, combined with her remarkable beauty, made her one of the most closely watched and discussed figures in the Greek world. The Queen's initial interactions with Bellerophon appeared to follow conventional patterns of royal hospitality toward distinguished guests. She ensured that he was provided with appropriate clothing befitting his royal birth, arranged for servants to attend to his needs, and included him in the formal banquets where foreign dignitaries were entertained. Her behaviour during these early encounters was marked by the careful courtesy expected of a queen receiving an exiled prince, with no indication of the personal interest that would soon complicate their relationship. Bellerophon's presence at the Corinthian court created considerable interest among the various diplomatic representatives, who recognised the potential political implications of his situation. His exile from Corinth had temporarily removed him from the line of succession, but his royal birth and heroic reputation made him a potentially valuable ally for any power seeking to influence Corinthian affairs. Several ambassadors attempted to cultivate relationships with the prince, offering various forms of support in exchange for future considerations should he ever return to power in his homeland. The physical layout of the palace facilitated numerous opportunities for private conversation between members of the court, as the complex arrangement of corridors, courtyards, and reception chambers allowed for discreet meetings away from the formal public spaces. Sthenoboia, as mistress of the household, possessed intimate knowledge of these private areas and could arrange encounters that would appear accidental to casual observers while serving her specific purposes. Her growing interest in Bellerophon led her to exploit these opportunities with increasing frequency. The Queen's attraction to the exiled prince developed gradually over the weeks following his arrival at Tiryns. Bellerophon's combination of royal bearing, physical prowess, and tragic circumstances created a romantic appeal that distinguished him from the typical diplomatic visitors who frequented the court. His youth and inexperience in court intrigue made him appear refreshingly honest compared to the calculating ambassadors and courtiers who usually surrounded her. Additionally, his temporary separation from political power paradoxically enhanced his attractiveness by making him appear more accessible and less threatening to existing power structures. Sthenoboia's initial approaches to Bellerophon were subtle and could easily be interpreted as extensions of royal hospitality rather than personal interest. She arranged for him to receive invitations to exclusive cultural events, such as private performances by visiting musicians and poets, where the intimate setting encouraged personal conversation. She consulted him on matters relating to Corinthian customs and politics, ostensibly to better understand diplomatic implications, but actually to create opportunities for extended private discussions. These interactions allowed her to assess his character and gauge his potential receptivity to more direct approaches. The Queen's seduction strategy revealed considerable sophistication in its understanding of masculine psychology and social dynamics. Rather than relying solely on her physical attractiveness, she appealed to Bellerophon's intellectual interests by discussing poetry, philosophy, and military tactics with a knowledge that impressed him and flattered his own learning. She presented herself as a kindred spirit trapped by the constraints of political marriage and royal duty, creating an emotional connection that complemented her physical appeal. Her approach was designed to make Bellerophon feel that he was the pursuer rather than the pursued, thereby avoiding the appearance of impropriety while achieving her desired goal. The cultural context of Sthenoboia's behaviour reflected the complex position of aristocratic women in Bronze Age Greek society. While formally subordinate to male authority, royal women often wielded considerable informal power through their roles as advisors, marriage brokers, and cultural patrons. Their education typically included training in rhetoric, literature, and statecraft that equipped them for political influence, while their control over household resources provided them with practical means of implementing their decisions. However, their sexuality was strictly regulated through legal and social mechanisms designed to ensure legitimate succession and prevent diplomatic complications. The tension between Sthenoboia's political sophistication and her sexual desires created a psychological conflict that intensified her pursuit of Bellerophon. Her marriage to Pretus, while politically advantageous and personally respectful, lacked the passionate intensity that her romantic imagination demanded. The arrival of a handsome young hero with a tragic history provided an opportunity to experience the kind of grand passion that featured prominently in the epic poetry she patronized. Her pursuit of Bellerophon represented not merely physical attraction, but a desire to participate in the heroic narratives that defined aristocratic culture. Bellerophon's response to the Queen's increasingly obvious advances was complicated by his genuine gratitude for the hospitality he had received and his natural attraction to her remarkable beauty and intelligence. However, his understanding of Xenia and its sacred obligations prevented him from seriously considering any romantic involvement with his host's wife. The concept of guest friendship explicitly prohibited any action that might dishonour or harm one's host, while violations of this principle were believed to bring severe divine punishment upon the transgressor. The prince's rejection of Sthenoboia's advances was based on practical as well as ethical considerations. His precarious position as an exiled suppliant made him entirely dependent on Pretus's continued goodwill for his safety and future prospects. Any scandal involving the Queen would inevitably result in his expulsion from Tiryns and possibly his death, as Pretus would be obligated to defend his honour regardless of his personal feelings toward his guest. Additionally, Bellerophon's recent experience with blood guilt had sensitized him to the potential consequences of actions that violated divine law. The specific incident that brought their relationship to a crisis occurred during a religious festival honouring Hera, the patron goddess of marriage and legitimate authority. The celebration involved elaborate processions, sacrificial ceremonies, and evening banquets that provided numerous opportunities for private interaction between court members. Sthenoboia, emboldened by wine and the romantic atmosphere created by the festival's emphasis on divine love, made a direct proposition to Bellerophon during a moment when they found themselves alone in a moonlit garden adjacent to the main palace complex. The Queen's proposition was delivered with characteristic sophistication, framed as a philosophical discussion about the nature of love and duty rather than a crude sexual invitation. She argued that true passion transcended conventional social boundaries and that their mutual attraction represented a divine gift that should not be rejected out of misplaced loyalty to inferior mortals. Her argument drew upon contemporary literary traditions that celebrated adultery between noble lovers as a higher form of human experience than conventional marriage, citing examples from epic poetry and tragic drama to support her position. Bellerophon's rejection of this proposition was immediate and unequivocal, though delivered with the courtesy appropriate to his status as guest and her position as queen. He explained his understanding of Xenia and its requirements, emphasizing that his honour as a guest depended upon his absolute respect for his host's household and property. He acknowledged the Queen's beauty and intelligence, while making clear that these very qualities made her more precious to Pretus, and therefore more completely forbidden to himself as a guest under divine protection. The prince's refusal to engage in adultery was also influenced by his recent experience with divine punishment and purification. His killing of either Deliades or Bellerophon had demonstrated the serious consequences of actions that violated cosmic order, even when undertaken without malicious intent. The prospect of deliberately committing a sin that would inevitably bring divine wrath seemed particularly foolish to someone who had recently undergone the complex rituals necessary to cleanse blood guilt. His rejection of Sthenoboia represented not merely ethical behaviour, but practical wisdom based on hard-won experience. Sthenoboia's reaction to this rejection revealed the intensity of her emotional investment in the relationship and the depth of her wounded pride. Her initial response was disbelief, as she had never previously encountered resistance to her charms from any man she'd chosen to pursue. The combination of her royal status, legendary beauty and sophisticated intelligence had always proven irresistible to previous targets of her attention. Bellerophon's refusal to succumb to these attractions challenged her fundamental understanding of her own power and desirability. The queen's wounded vanity quickly transformed into a more dangerous emotion as she realized the implications of the situation she had created. Her direct proposition to Bellerophon had placed her in a vulnerable position where her reputation and political influence could be destroyed if knowledge of her behaviour became public. The prince's knowledge of her attempted adultery gave him potential power over her that she found intolerable, while his moral superiority in rejecting her advances made her feel diminished and humiliated. The psychological dynamics of Sthenoboia's response reflected broader patterns in Greek literature and society regarding the consequences of spurned love. The cultural expectation that beautiful and powerful women should be able to obtain any man they desired made rejection particularly traumatic for aristocratic women accustomed to deference and admiration. The shame associated with failed seduction was considered more damaging to feminine honour than successful adultery, as it implied inadequacy rather than mere moral weakness. Sthenoboia's decision to accuse Bellerophon of attempted rape represented a calculated response designed to transform her vulnerability into a position of strength. By claiming that he'd tried to force himself upon her, she could present herself as the innocent victim of masculine aggression, rather than the frustrated pursuer of an unattainable lover. This strategy would eliminate the threat to her reputation, while simultaneously removing Bellerophon from her presence and punishing him for his rejection of her advances. The false accusation was crafted with considerable attention to psychological and legal credibility. Sthenoboia claimed that Bellerophon had approached her during the Hera festival, using his status as honoured guest to gain access to private areas of the palace where he could corner her without witnesses. According to her account, he had declared his passion for her and attempted to embrace her by force when she rejected his advances. Only her threats to summon the palace guards had prevented him from completing his assault, though not before he had torn her clothing and left marks upon her arms that could serve as physical evidence. The Queen's performance in presenting this accusation to her husband demonstrated her considerable skills in manipulation and theatrical presentation. She appeared before Pegasus in a state of carefully orchestrated distress, her clothing artfully dishevelled and her demeanour suggesting barely controlled hysteria. Her account of the alleged assault was delivered with sufficient emotional intensity to appear genuine while maintaining enough coherence to be legally actionable. She demanded immediate justice for the violation of her honour and the betrayal of royal hospitality that Bellerophon's supposed actions represented. Pegasus's response to his wife's accusation reflected the complex political and personal considerations that complicated his position as both husband and king. His love for Sthenoboia and his duty to protect her honour demanded immediate action against her alleged assailant, while his obligations under Xenia prevented him from directly harming a guest who remained under divine protection. The contradiction between these competing duties created a dilemma that required careful resolution to avoid violating either marital or religious obligations. The king's investigation of the accusation was necessarily limited by the private nature of the alleged incident and the absence of independent witnesses. Sthenoboia's status as queen and her reputation for intelligence and virtue gave considerable weight to her testimony, while Bellerophon's position as an exile seeking purification made him appear potentially capable of desperate actions. The physical evidence that the Queen presented, including torn clothing and bruises that could have been inflicted during a struggle, supported her version of events without definitively proving Bellerophon's guilt. Proetus's ultimate decision to avoid direct confrontation with Bellerophon reflected both his uncertainty about the truth of the accusation and his desire to resolve the situation without violating the sacred obligations of hospitality. Rather than ordering the prince's immediate execution or expulsion, he chose a more subtle approach that would remove Bellerophon from his court while potentially achieving justice if the accusation proved true. This solution involved dispatching his unwelcome guest to Lycia with a sealed letter addressed to King Iobates, Sthenabea's father. The letter that Proetus composed for delivery to Iobates represented one of the most famous examples of the literary motif known as the Uriah letter, named after the biblical account of King David's instructions for the death of Bathsheba's husband. This device, which appears in various forms throughout ancient literature, involves the unwitting delivery of written orders for the bearer's own destruction. The psychological appeal of this motif lies in its combination of dramatic irony and poetic justice, as the victim becomes an active participant in his own downfall. The specific contents of Proetus's letter to Iobates were carefully crafted to achieve maximum effectiveness while maintaining plausible deniability should the document ever be examined by unauthorized parties. The message began with conventional diplomatic pleasantries and expressions of familial affection appropriate to correspondence between royal in-laws. It then proceeded to describe Bellerophon's presence at the Terinthian court and his status as a purified exile from Corinth, presenting this information as background for the request that followed. The crucial portion of the letter contained Proetus's allegation that Bellerophon had attempted to seduce or assault Sthenabea, though the language was sufficiently ambiguous to allow for multiple interpretations of the specific offence. Proetus explained that his obligations under Xenia prevented him from taking direct action against his guest, but suggested that Iobates, as the injured party's father and a ruler not bound by guest friendship with the prince, might be better positioned to ensure appropriate justice. The letter concluded with a request that Iobates deal with the situation in whatever manner he deemed most suitable for protecting family honour and maintaining proper relationships between their kingdoms. The selection of Iobates as the recipient of this dangerous correspondence was not accidental, as Proetus recognised that the Lycian king's relationship to Sthenabea would make him particularly motivated to punish anyone who dishonoured his daughter. Additionally, Iobates' reputation for decisive action and his distance from Greek political complications made him an ideal agent for resolving the situation without creating diplomatic repercussions that might affect Proetus's other relationships. The geographical separation between Lycia and Greece would also ensure that Bellerophon's fate would be determined far from Tyrrhen's, reducing the risk of divine retribution for violations of hospitality. The physical preparation of the letter followed established protocols for confidential royal correspondence, with the document written on specially prepared parchment using ink mixed with distinctive additives that would reveal any attempts at tampering. The text was composed in a diplomatic cipher, known only to members of the royal families involved, ensuring that casual inspection by intermediaries would not reveal its contents. The completed letter was sealed with Proetus's personal signet ring, pressed into wax mixed with aromatic resins that would make unauthorized opening immediately apparent to the recipient. Bellerophon's selection as the bearer of this fatal message represented the final element in Proetus's carefully constructed solution to his domestic and diplomatic crisis. By entrusting the prince with what appeared to be an important diplomatic communication, the king could present the mission as an honour befitting Bellerophon's royal status, while simultaneously removing him from the Terinthian court. The apparent trust implied by this assignment would make any suspicion about the letter's content seem paranoid and ungrateful, while the urgency of the diplomatic mission would prevent extended delays that might allow the true situation to be discovered. The instructions given to Bellerophon regarding his journey to Lycia emphasise the importance of delivering the letter personally to King Iobates without allowing it to be examined or copied by intermediaries. Proetus explained that the message contained sensitive information regarding potential military cooperation between Tiryns and Lycia that could be compromised if it fell into the wrong hands. He stressed that the success of important diplomatic initiatives depended upon the prince's discretion and reliability in carrying out this mission, appealing to his sense of honour and duty as a member of the royal class. The journey from Tiryns to Lycia stretched across approximately 400 miles of treacherous terrain and unpredictable seas, requiring Bellerophon to traverse the breadth of the Aegean world during the height of the Bronze Age trading season. The route began with an overland passage through the mountainous interior of the Peloponnese, where ancient paths wound between peaks sacred to various deities and through valleys controlled by local chieftains who maintained uneasy relationships with the major kingdoms. These highland regions, populated by semi-nomadic tribes who had resisted incorporation into the expanding palace-centred civilizations, required careful negotiation and the payment of traditional tolls to ensure safe passage. The prince's journey took him first through the territory of Argos, where massive tholos tombs dotted the landscape like artificial hills, their corbelled chambers housing the remains of warrior kings from earlier generations. The road passed within sight of Mycenae itself, its lion gate visible on the distant Acropolis, reminding travellers of the military power that had once dominated the entire region. Local inhabitants still spoke in hushed tones of the great expeditions that had departed from these citadels, carrying Greek warriors to distant lands in search of glory and plunder. From the Argolid, the route continued eastward through territories controlled by various minor kingdoms and independent city-states, each maintaining its own customs regarding the passage of foreign travellers. Some rulers demanded formal presentations at their courts, viewing the transit of exiled royalty as an opportunity to gather intelligence about political developments in major kingdoms. Others were content with simple toll payments and the assurance that the traveller carried no hostile intentions toward their territories. Bellerophon's status as a purified exile generally ensured respectful treatment, as most local authorities recognised the religious protections that surrounded those who had undergone proper cleansing rituals. The overland portion of the journey concluded at one of several Aegean ports where regular shipping connections existed with the Anatolian coast. These harbours, typically located in protected bays with adequate freshwater supplies and defensive positions, served as crucial links in the commercial networks that connected Greece with the wealthy kingdoms of Asia Minor. The port facilities included extensive warehouses for storing goods awaiting shipment, workshops where craftsmen produced items specifically for export markets, and residential quarters for foreign merchants who maintained permanent trading establishments. The maritime leg of the journey presented different challenges, as Aegean waters during the late Bronze Age were notorious for both natural hazards and human predators. Seasonal wind patterns could trap vessels in unfavourable position for weeks at a time, while sudden storms generated by the complex interaction of sea and mountainous terrain could destroy even well-built ships within hours. Piracy represented an equally serious threat, as various groups of sea raiders operated from hidden bases among the numerous islands, preying upon merchant vessels and passenger ships that lacked adequate military protection. The ships available for passenger service varied considerably in size, construction and reliability, reflecting the diverse origins of the merchants and mariners who operated them. Mycenaean vessels, built according to traditional Greek designs, featured deep hulls suitable for carrying heavy cargoes and reinforced construction that could withstand the stresses of extended voyages. Phoenician ships, increasingly common in Aegean waters, incorporated innovations developed through their extensive experience with long-distance trade, including improved steering mechanisms and more efficient sail configurations. Local island craft, while smaller and less suitable for extended voyages, offered intimate knowledge of coastal waters and hidden harbours that could prove invaluable during emergencies. The crossing to the Lycian coast required approximately 3 days under favourable conditions, though adverse weather or navigational difficulties could extend the journey significantly. Passengers typically brought their own food supplies, as shipboard provisions were generally limited to basic necessities required by the crew. Sleeping arrangements consisted of simple bedrolls laid out on deck or in cargo areas, with privacy and comfort being luxuries available only to the wealthiest travellers willing to pay premium rates for special accommodations. Lycia itself represented one of the most sophisticated and strategically important kingdoms in the Eastern Mediterranean during this period. The region's location along the southern coast of Anatolia placed it at the intersection of trade routes connecting Greece, Egypt, Cyprus, and the emerging Hittite Empire, making it a natural centre for commercial and diplomatic activity. The kingdom's prosperity derived not only from its advantageous position, but also from its control of valuable natural resources, including timber from the Taurus Mountains, precious metals from highland mines, and agricultural products from fertile coastal plains. The political structure of Bronze Age Lycia reflected the complex ethnic and cultural composition of its population, which included indigenous Anatolian peoples, Greek colonists, and various immigrant groups attracted by commercial opportunities. King Iobates ruled from the capital city of Xanthos, located approximately 20 miles inland from the coast along the banks of the river that shared the city's name. This strategic position provided protection from seaborne raiders while maintaining access to maritime trade through subsidiary ports along the coast. The Lycian monarchy had evolved sophisticated administrative systems to manage its diverse territories and populations, with royal authority exercised through a network of regional governors, local chieftains, and urban magistrates who maintained order while collecting taxes and tribute for the central government. The king's court at Xanthos functioned as the focal point for this administrative network, hosting regular assemblies where representatives from throughout the kingdom reported on local conditions and received instructions regarding royal policy. The architectural grandeur of Xanthos reflected both the kingdom's wealth and its cultural sophistication, with the royal palace complex covering several acres of carefully terraced hillside overlooking the river valley. The main palace building, constructed from local limestone and decorated with carved reliefs depicting royal hunts and military victories, contained throne rooms, banquet halls, and residential quarters capable of accommodating hundreds of courtiers, officials, and visiting dignitaries. Adjacent structures housed administrative offices, workshops for royal craftsmen, and storage facilities for the tribute and taxes collected throughout the kingdom. The cultural atmosphere of Iobates' court combined traditional Anatolian customs with influences absorbed through extensive contact with Greek, Egyptian, and Near Eastern civilizations. The king himself was fluent in several languages and maintained correspondence with rulers throughout the known world, making his court a centre for international diplomacy and cultural exchange. Royal patronage supported poets, musicians, and artists from various traditions, creating a cosmopolitan environment where different cultural forms interacted and influenced each other. The religious practices observed at the Lycian court reflected this cultural diversity, with traditional Anatolian deities worshipped alongside Greek gods and goddesses introduced by colonial populations. The king served as chief priest for certain state ceremonies while delegating other religious functions to specialists trained in particular traditions. This religious tolerance was both politically practical, ensuring the loyalty of diverse population groups, and economically beneficial, as it facilitated trade relationships with partners from different cultural backgrounds. Bellerophon's arrival at the Lycian court occurred during the autumn season when King Iobates traditionally received foreign embassies and conducted major diplomatic business. The timing was particularly significant because it coincided with annual festivals celebrating the harvest and honouring the deities responsible for agricultural prosperity. These celebrations attracted visitors from throughout the kingdom and beyond, creating an atmosphere of festivity and international exchange that would provide an appropriate context for receiving an exiled Greek prince bearing important correspondence. The formal protocols governing the reception of foreign dignitaries at the Lycian court had been refined through centuries of diplomatic experience, with specific procedures established for different categories of visitors based on their status, origin, and the nature of their business. Exiled royalty occupied a particularly complex position within these protocols, as they retained certain ceremonial privileges based on their birth while lacking the political authority normally associated with royal status. The challenge for court officials lay in providing appropriate honours without creating diplomatic complications with the rulers who had expelled or were currently hosting such individuals. The initial stages of Bellerophon's reception followed established patterns for distinguished foreign visitors, with palace officials conducting preliminary interviews to determine his identity, background, and the nature of his business with the king. These interviews served multiple purposes. They provided information necessary for planning appropriate ceremonies. They allowed security personnel to assess potential threats, and they gave court officials opportunities to gather intelligence about political developments in the visitor's homeland. The physical presentation of the sealed letter from Pegasus created immediate interest among Iobates' advisors, who recognised the diplomatic significance of formal correspondence between royal houses. The quality of the parchment, the distinctive characteristics of the seal, and the ceremonial manner in which Bellerophon presented the document all indicated that it contained matters of considerable importance. However, established diplomatic protocol required that such communications be opened and read privately by the king before any public acknowledgement of their contents. The guest-host relationship that developed between Iobates and Bellerophon during the initial period following the prince's arrival exemplified the complex obligations and expectations associated with Xenia in international contexts. The Lycian king's responsibilities as host were complicated by his lack of direct knowledge about his guest's character and recent history, requiring him to rely on traditional assumptions about royal behaviour while remaining alert to potential complications that might arise from the political circumstances surrounding Bellerophon's exile. The accommodations provided for Bellerophon within the palace complex reflected his ambiguous status as both honoured guest and potential security concern. He was assigned quarters in a section of the palace traditionally reserved for visiting dignitaries, with rooms that provided comfort and privacy while allowing palace guards to monitor his activities discreetly. The location offered easy access to public areas where court ceremonies and social gatherings took place, while maintaining sufficient separation from sensitive areas where confidential business was conducted. The daily routine established for Bellerophon during his stay at the Lycian court included participation in various ceremonial and social activities designed to honour his royal birth while keeping him occupied during the period required for Iobates to consider the contents of Pegasus' letter. Morning activities typically involved attendance at religious ceremonies, honouring various deities, where his presence demonstrated proper respect for Lycian customs while providing opportunities for court officials to observe his behaviour and character. Afternoon activities often centred around athletic competitions and military exercises that were regular features of court life, serving both entertainment and training purposes for the young nobles and professional warriors who formed the king's military household. Bellerophon's participation in these activities provided him with opportunities to demonstrate his physical prowess and martial skills, while allowing Iobates and his advisors to assess his capabilities as a potential military asset or threat. Evening entertainments at the Lycian court featured elaborate banquets where visiting dignitaries, local nobles and court officials gathered to conduct informal diplomacy while enjoying food, wine and artistic performances. These gatherings served crucial functions in the kingdom's political system, providing venues where different factions could negotiate agreements, where information could be exchanged between various interest groups, and where the king could gauge opinion on important policy matters through careful observation of social interactions. The private deliberations that occupied King Iobates following his reading of Proetus' letter reveal the complex considerations that influence royal decision-making in matters involving family honour, international relations, and religious obligations. The letter's contents placed him in a position remarkably similar to that which had confronted Proetus himself, though with the additional complication that the alleged victim was his own daughter rather than his wife. The accusation that Bellerophon had attempted to assault or seduce Thenobia demanded action to defend family honour, while the prince's status as a guest under divine protection created religious obstacles to direct retaliation. The strategic implications of the situation extended beyond immediate questions of justice and honour to encompass broader political relationships between Lycia and various Greek kingdoms. Iobates' response to Proetus' request would influence future diplomatic cooperation between their realms, while his treatment of a Corinthian prince could affect Lycia's relationships with other Greek powers who might view the case as a precedent for how their own exiled nobles would be received in foreign courts. The king's advisors offered various perspectives on the appropriate course of action, reflecting different priorities and areas of expertise within the royal administration. Military commanders emphasized the importance of demonstrating strength and resolve in defending royal family honour, arguing that failure to punish Bellerophon would encourage similar offences by other foreign visitors. Diplomatic officials stressed the need to avoid actions that might damage Lycia's reputation for hospitality and fair dealing, which had been crucial to the kingdom's success in international commerce and alliance building. Religious authorities consulted ancient texts and performed divination rituals to determine divine preferences regarding the proper resolution of the conflict between guest friendship obligations and family honour. These consultations revealed significant complexity in the relevant religious law, with different traditions offering varying interpretations of the relative importance of competing sacred duties. Some sources suggested that the pollution associated with violations of Xenia was so severe that it outweighed other considerations, while others argued that certain offences against family honour created equally serious religious obligations that could not be ignored. The solution that eventually emerged from these deliberations reflected Iobates' considerable experience in managing complex political situations where competing interests and obligations created seemingly impossible dilemmas. Rather than choosing between direct execution, which would violate guest friendship, and complete forgiveness, which would fail to address the alleged offence against his daughter, he developed a more subtle approach that would test both Bellerophon's character and the truth of the accusations against him. The concept of assigning seemingly impossible tasks to resolve difficult political situations had precedence in both Greek and Near Eastern royal tradition, offering rulers a means of achieving desired outcomes while maintaining plausible claims to fairness and divine approval. These challenges typically involved missions so dangerous that few individuals could reasonably be expected to survive them, while their completion would demonstrate either divine favour or exceptional heroic qualities that might justify clemency. The psychological appeal of this approach lay in its apparent objectivity. A success or failure would seem to depend on factors beyond human control rather than arbitrary royal decision. The specific nature of the tasks that Iobates would assign to Bellerophon reflected both the particular threats facing the Lycian kingdom and the king's assessment of challenges that would provide appropriate tests of the prince's character and capabilities. The selection of these missions required careful consideration of their difficulty level, their potential benefit to the kingdom if successfully completed, and their symbolic significance in demonstrating divine judgment regarding Bellerophon's guilt or innocence. The weight of King Iobates' impossible tasks pressed heavily upon Bellerophon's mind as he withdrew to his assigned chambers within the palace complex at Xanthos. The Lycian king's pronouncement had been delivered with ceremonial formality during the evening banquet, witnessed by dozens of court officials and foreign dignitaries who would carry news of the challenge throughout the Mediterranean world. The first task alone, the destruction of the Chimera, represented a death sentence disguised as heroic opportunity, as no mortal warrior had ever survived an encounter with the fire-breathing monster that terrorized the Lycian countryside. The prince's quarters, located in the eastern wing of the palace where morning sunlight would filter through elaborately carved stone lattices, provided a sanctuary where he could contemplate his desperate situation without the scrutiny of court observers. The rooms themselves reflected the sophisticated craftsmanship that characterized Lycian royal architecture, with walls decorated in painted frescoes depicting scenes from local mythology and floors covered in intricate mosaics created from coloured stones quarried in the nearby mountains. Despite their luxury, these chambers felt more like an elegant prison, as Bellerophon considered the virtual impossibility of the challenges that awaited him. The Chimera's reputation throughout the eastern Mediterranean was based on decades of destructive raids that had devastated entire regions and left behind landscapes scarred by supernatural fire. Descriptions of the creature varied among different sources, but all accounts agreed on its fundamentally unnatural composition, combining the most dangerous aspects of multiple predatory animals into a single entity of unprecedented lethality. The monster's lion head possessed jaws capable of crushing bronze shields, while its goat body provided the agility necessary to navigate mountainous terrain where conventional armies could not pursue it. Most terrifying of all was the serpent tail that could strike with lightning speed, delivering venom that caused agonizing death within minutes of contact. The supernatural fire that the Chimera breathed represented perhaps its most devastating weapon, as this flame could not be extinguished by water or sand, and burned with such intensity that it could melt bronze armour and reduce stone fortifications to slag. Witnesses who had survived encounters with the monster described flames that appeared to burn in unnatural colours, shifting between deep red, brilliant white, and an eerie blue-green that seemed to consume light itself. The psychological impact of this otherworldly fire often proved as destructive as its physical effects, as even seasoned warriors would flee in terror when confronted with flames that violated their understanding of natural law. Previous attempts to destroy the Chimera had involved some of the most accomplished warriors and military formations available to various Anatolian kingdoms, yet all had ended in catastrophic failure that only enhanced the monster's fearsome reputation. Lydian heavy cavalry, renowned for their discipline and equipment, had been reduced to charred bones and melted bronze within minutes of engaging the creature. Phrygian infantry formations, supported by siege engines and protected by overlapping shield walls, had been scattered like leaves before the supernatural flames that rendered their defensive tactics useless. Even individual heroes with legendary reputations had perished in futile attempts to claim the glory associated with slaying such a notorious monster. The geographical challenges associated with hunting the Chimera added additional layers of difficulty to an already impossible task. The creature's primary lair was located in the mountainous interior of Lycia, where steep ravines and treacherous paths made cavalry operations impossible, while providing numerous escape routes for a flying opponent. The region's complex topography included hidden caves where the monster could retreat when threatened, underground passages that allowed it to appear unexpectedly in new locations, and elevated positions from which it could survey approaching enemies while remaining beyond the range of conventional weapons. Local populations in areas affected by the Chimera's depredations had developed elaborate warning systems and defensive procedures based on bitter experience with the creature's hunting patterns. Shepherds and farmers maintained constant vigilance for signs of the monster's presence, including the distinctive sulphurous odour that preceded its arrival, and the unnatural silence that fell over wildlife when it approached. Villagers had constructed underground shelters where residents could hide during attacks. though these refuges often became death traps when the Chimera's flames penetrated through ventilation shafts or entrance passages. The religious significance attributed to the Chimera by various local cults complicated efforts to organise systematic campaigns against it, as some groups viewed the monster as a divine punishment for unspecified transgressions or as a sacred guardian protecting ancient burial sites from desecration. These beliefs had led to active resistance against military expeditions, with cult members providing intelligence to help the creature avoid traps while spreading propaganda that discouraged potential heroes from attempting to destroy what they considered a manifestation of divine will. As Bellerophon contemplated these overwhelming obstacles during his first night in the Lycian palace, his thoughts turned increasingly toward divine intervention as the only possible source of assistance sufficient to overcome such supernatural opposition. The prince's recent experience with blood guilt and purification had sensitized him to the reality of divine influence in mortal affairs, while his royal education had included extensive instruction in the proper methods for seeking celestial aid through prayer, sacrifice, and ritual observance. The tradition of heroic prayer in Greek religious practice encompassed far more than simple requests for assistance, involving complex theological concepts about the relationship between mortal effort and divine favour. Heroes were expected to demonstrate their worthiness through courage, intelligence, and proper respect for religious obligations before the gods would consider intervening on their behalf. The prayers themselves required precise formulation using archaic language and traditional formulas that had been preserved through generations of oral transmission by priests and religious specialists. Bellerophon's prayers during this period of crisis drew upon his extensive knowledge of religious protocol, while incorporating personal elements that reflected his specific circumstances and desperate need for divine assistance. He began each prayer session with elaborate purification rituals involving ritual washing with water drawn from sacred springs, the burning of specific incense combinations that were believed to attract divine attention, and the recitation of genealogical formulas that established his legitimate claim to heroic status through his royal lineage. The physical setting for these prayers was carefully chosen to maximize their effectiveness according to established religious principles. The palace at Xanthos included several shrines dedicated to various deities, but Bellerophon selected a small sanctuary devoted to Athena that was located in a secluded courtyard where he could pray without interruption. The shrine itself was modest compared to the grand temples found in major Greek cities, consisting of a simple altar surrounded by marble columns and decorated with painted scenes depicting the goddess's various aspects and attributes. The timing of Bellerophon's prayers followed astronomical and religious calendars that determined the most auspicious moments for communicating with specific deities. Athena was traditionally approached during the pre-dawn hours when the planet Venus appeared as the morning star, symbolizing the goddess's role as bringer of wisdom and divine illumination. These early morning prayer sessions required the prince to rise well before the palace household began its daily activities, providing him with the solitude necessary for the intense concentration that effective prayer demanded. The content of Bellerophon's prayers revealed both his sophisticated understanding of theological principles and his genuine desperation in the face of seemingly impossible challenges. He acknowledged Athena's supreme wisdom and her traditional role as patron of heroes who faced overwhelming odds, citing specific examples from religious literature where the goddess had intervened to assist mortals engaged in righteous causes. He emphasized his own commitment to justice and proper behavior, particularly his refusal to violate the sacred obligations of guest friendship, despite the personal costs this decision had imposed upon him. The prince's prayers also included detailed confessions of his past errors and expressions of genuine remorse for the killing that had led to his current predicament. He acknowledged that his exile and current dangers might represent divine punishment for his actions, while expressing willingness to accept whatever fate the gods deemed appropriate for his transgressions. This combination of humility and determination demonstrated the psychological complexity that characterized effective heroic prayer, balancing acknowledgement of human limitations with confidence in divine justice. The theological framework underlying Bellerophon's appeals to Athena reflected sophisticated understanding of the goddess's particular interests and areas of responsibility within the Greek pantheon. As the deity associated with strategic warfare rather than mere violence, Athena was believed to favour heroes who relied on intelligence and careful planning rather than brute force alone. Her patronage of craftsmanship and technological innovation made her an appropriate choice for someone facing challenges that would require unconventional solutions and supernatural equipment. Athena's role as protector of cities and civilized order provided additional theological justification for seeking her intervention against the Chimera, which represented chaotic destruction that threatened the stability of human communities. The goddess's traditional opposition to monsters and supernatural threats that disrupted cosmic order aligned perfectly with Bellerophon's mission, suggesting that his success would serve divine purposes beyond mere personal survival or glory. The dreams that began to visit Bellerophon during his nights of intense prayer represented the initial manifestation of divine response to his appeals, though their symbolic content required careful interpretation according to established principles of religious dream analysis. Greek religious tradition recognized several categories of divinely inspired dreams, ranging from direct communications containing explicit instructions to symbolic visions that required priestly interpretation to understand their true meaning. The first significant dream occurred on the third night following Bellerophon's receipt of his impossible tasks, appearing during the deepest phase of sleep, when the mind was believed to be most receptive to divine communication. In this vision, the prince found himself standing in a vast temple unlike any earthly structure he had ever seen, with columns that seemed to stretch infinitely upward and walls decorated with moving frescoes that depicted scenes from past, present, and future heroic adventures. The Dream Temple's most striking feature was an enormous statue of Athena that dominated the central chamber, carved from what appeared to be a single block of ivory and gold that gleamed with inner light. The goddess's eyes, crafted from precious stones that seemed to contain actual starlight, tracked Bellerophon's movements as he approached the altar at the statue's base. Her expression conveyed both stern judgment and compassionate understanding, suggesting that his prayers had been heard and evaluated according to divine standards of justice and worthiness. The symbolic elements present in this initial dream required careful analysis to understand their prophetic significance. The temple's infinite dimensions suggested the unlimited nature of divine power and wisdom, while the moving frescoes indicated that Bellerophon's current trials were part of a larger pattern of heroic destiny that extended beyond his immediate circumstances. The goddess's dual expression of sternness and compassion implied that while his past actions required expiation, his current situation provided opportunities for redemption through proper conduct and divine service. Subsequent dreams built upon these initial symbolic foundations while providing increasingly specific guidance regarding the challenges that awaited him. The second major vision featured Bellerophon standing on a high mountain peak overlooking a landscape that combined recognizable Lycian geography with otherworldly elements that defied natural law. In the distance, he could see the Chimera's lair, marked by columns of unnatural flame that rose from hidden caverns and cast eerie shadows across the surrounding terrain. The dream's most significant element was the appearance of a magnificent winged horse that descended from the clouds above the mountain peak, its coat gleaming with silver radiance and its wings spanning distances that seemed to dwarf the largest eagles. The creature's eyes held intelligence that clearly distinguished it from ordinary animals, while its bearing suggested noble breeding that rivaled the finest earthly steeds. As the winged horse approached, Bellerophon felt an overwhelming sense of recognition. as though he had been destined to encounter this magnificent creature since birth. The symbolic significance of the winged horse in Greek religious thought connected it directly to divine intervention and the transcendence of normal human limitations. Wings represented the ability to rise above earthly constraints and approach the realm of the gods, while horses symbolized nobility, speed, and the warrior virtues essential for heroic achievement. The combination of these attributes in a single creature suggested that divine assistance would take the form of supernatural capabilities that could overcome obstacles impossible for ordinary mortals to surmount. The third and most detailed dream provided explicit instructions regarding the location where Bellerophon could expect to receive the divine assistance that his prayers had requested. In this vision, he found himself standing before the altar in Athena's shrine within the palace, but the modest sanctuary had been transformed into a magnificent temple that rivaled the greatest religious structures in Greece. The walls glowed with soft golden light that seemed to emanate from the stone itself, while the air vibrated with harmonious sounds that suggested the presence of invisible choirs singing hymns in languages older than human civilization. The dream goddess who appeared before the altar bore little resemblance to conventional artistic representations of Athena, instead manifesting as a figure of such radiant beauty and terrible power that Bellerophon could barely comprehend her true nature. Her armour seemed to be forged from captured starlight, while her shield reflected images of all the heroes she had aided throughout history. The spear she carried appeared to be carved from a single shaft of crystallized lightning, crackling with barely contained energy that could shatter mountains or pierce the hearts of immortal monsters. The divine communication that followed transcended ordinary speech, conveying meaning directly to Bellerophon's consciousness through methods that bypassed normal sensory perception. The goddess revealed that his prayers had been accepted and that divine assistance would be provided, though the form of this aid would require him to demonstrate courage, wisdom, and unwavering faith in divine justice. She explained that the challenges he faced were indeed tests designed to prove his worthiness for greater destinies, while warning that failure would result not merely in death, but in eternal dishonour that would affect his soul's fate in the afterlife. The specific instructions provided in this dream focused on the ritual procedures that Bellerophon would need to follow to receive the promised divine assistance. He was told to return to Athena's shrine at the moment of dawn on the following day, bringing offerings that demonstrated both his material sacrifice and spiritual commitment to the goddess's service. The required offerings included a white lamb without blemish, honey from bees that had never been disturbed by human hands, wine from grapes that had been blessed by priests of Dionysus, and incense made from rare resins that could only be obtained from trees growing in sacred groves. The procurement of these ritual materials presented significant challenges given Bellerophon's status as a foreign guest with limited resources and no established relationships with local merchants or religious authorities. However, his royal birth and the circumstances of his mission provided him with sufficient credibility to approach palace officials for assistance, though he was careful to present his requests as preparation for prayers seeking divine guidance rather than specific ritual requirements revealed through prophetic dreams. The white lamb required for the sacrifice was obtained from the palace's own flocks, which included animals specifically maintained for religious purposes and regularly inspected by priests to ensure their ritual purity. The selection process involved careful examination of potential sacrificial victims to identify any physical defects or behavioral abnormalities that might render them unsuitable for divine offering. The lamb ultimately chosen was a young male of perfect proportions, with fleece so white it seemed to glow in sunlight, and eyes that reflected the calm temperament essential for acceptable sacrificial animals. The honey presented more complex procurement challenges, as the requirement for complete freedom from human disturbance eliminated most commercial sources available in the palace or local markets. Bellerophon was eventually directed to a remote mountain shrine, where wild bees had established hives in ancient olive trees that were considered sacred to Athena. The collection of this honey required a dangerous nighttime expedition to avoid disturbing the bees during their active periods, with the prince relying on local guides who possessed traditional knowledge of the shrine's location and the proper rituals for approaching the sacred trees. The blessed wine came from the palace's ceremonial reserves, which included vintages that had been consecrated during religious festivals and stored in specially prepared chambers where they could age without contamination from mundane influences. These wines were typically reserved for the most important state ceremonies and religious observances, making their release for private use a significant indication of the respect that Bellerophon's mission had earned among palace officials who remained unaware of the true nature of King Iobates' intentions. The rare incense required for the ritual proved to be the most difficult component to obtain, as the specified resins came from trees that grew only in remote mountain groves, protected by local religious taboos and geographical obstacles. The procurement of these materials required negotiations with mountain tribes, who served as guardians of the sacred groves, conducted through intermediaries who possessed the cultural knowledge necessary to navigate complex ritual protocols and traditional obligations that governed access to such religiously significant locations. The dawn ceremony that followed these elaborate preparations represented one of the most significant religious experiences in Bellerophon's life, combining elements of traditional Greek ritual practice with supernatural manifestations that transcended normal religious observance. The prince arrived at Athena's shrine while the eastern sky still showed only the faintest hints of approaching daylight, carrying the required offerings in vessels of polished bronze that had been purified according to ancient protocols. The preliminary rituals began with the lighting of sacred fires using methods that avoided any contact with mundane flame sources, instead employing traditional techniques involving the friction of specially prepared wood that had been blessed by priests and stored in temple sanctuaries. The resulting flames burned with unusual colours and gave off aromatic smoke that seemed to carry prayers directly toward the heavens, creating an atmosphere of supernatural expectancy that prepared the ritual space for divine manifestation. The sacrifice of the white lamb followed established procedures that had been preserved through centuries of religious tradition, with each step performed according to precise requirements that ensured divine acceptance of the offering. The animal's throat was cut with a bronze knife that had been consecrated specifically for ritual use, while prayers were recited in archaic Greek dialects that preserved the exact formulations believed necessary for effective communication with the goddess. The moment of divine intervention arrived as the first rays of sunlight struck the shrine's altar, transforming the modest sanctuary into a space filled with supernatural radiance that seemed to emanate from invisible sources within the stone itself. The air began to shimmer with golden particles that danced in patterns too complex for human eyes to follow completely, while harmonious sounds filled the space with music that suggested the presence of invisible choirs singing in celestial languages. The materialization of Athena's gift occurred gradually, beginning with the appearance of a golden bridle that seemed to condense from the shimmering air above the altar. The bridle's construction demonstrated craftsmanship that exceeded any earthly standard, with leather that appeared to be woven from captured sunbeams and metal fittings that gleamed with the soft radiance of starlight. Every surface was decorated with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly, depicting scenes of heroic adventures and divine interventions that spanned the entire history of mortal interaction with the gods. The bridle's supernatural properties were immediately apparent to anyone who observed it. As the leather remained supple despite its obviously ancient origins, while the metal components showed no signs of tarnish or wear that would be expected from normal materials. The overall design combined functional effectiveness with aesthetic beauty in ways that demonstrated divine rather than mortal craftsmanship, suggesting that this was indeed a gift worthy of the goddess's direct intervention in mortal affairs. The symbolic significance of a bridle as Athena's chosen gift reflected the goddess's deep understanding of the challenges that awaited Bellerophon and the specific type of assistance that would be most effective in overcoming them. A bridle represented control and partnership between human intelligence and animal power, suggesting that success would require not the domination of supernatural forces, but their willing cooperation in achieving righteous goals. The golden material emphasized the divine nature of this partnership while indicating that the relationship would elevate both participants above their normal limitations. The religious implications of receiving such a direct divine gift carried both tremendous privileges and equally serious responsibilities for the recipient. Bellerophon's possession of Athena's bridle marked him as a chosen instrument of divine will, entitled to supernatural assistance, but also obligated to use this aid only for purposes that served the goddess's interests and maintained cosmic order. The gift represented not merely a tool for overcoming immediate challenges, but a permanent transformation of his relationship with the divine realm that would influence all his future actions and decisions. The golden bridle's divine radiance had barely faded from the shrine when Bellerophon understood that Athena's gift was merely the first component of a solution that would require him to seek out and capture the legendary winged horse known throughout the Mediterranean world as Pegasus. The creature's origins traced back to one of the most horrific episodes in heroic mythology, when Perseus had severed the head of Medusa, the most terrible of the three Gorgon sisters whose gaze could transform living beings into stone. From the spurting blood of the decapitated monster had sprung two offspring, the warrior Chrysaor who had fathered giants and monsters, and Pegasus, whose divine nature elevated him far above ordinary equine bloodlines. The mythological circumstances surrounding Pegasus's birth reflected the complex theological principles that governed the relationship between divine procreation and monstrous transformation in Greek religious thought. Medusa herself had originally been a beautiful priestess serving in Athena's temple, renowned throughout the Greek world for her magnificent hair and devoted religious service. Her transformation into a monster had resulted from Poseidon's violent assault upon her within the sacred precincts of Athena's sanctuary, an act of sacrilege that had polluted the temple and demanded divine retribution. However, the goddess's punishment had fallen upon the victim rather than the perpetrator, transforming Medusa into a creature whose very appearance brought death to any mortal who looked upon her. The theological complexity of this myth extended to the nature of Pegasus himself, whose divine parentage through Poseidon was balanced by his monstrous maternal heritage through the transformed Medusa. This dual nature manifested in the horse's extraordinary capabilities, which combined the speed and nobility associated with Poseidon's domain over horses with supernatural abilities that transcended normal animal limitations. The wings that enabled Pegasus to soar through the heavens represented his connection to the divine realm, while his fierce independence and resistance to mortal control reflected the wild, untamed aspects of his monstrous lineage. The winged horse's behaviour patterns had been observed by shepherds, hunters, and travellers throughout the eastern Mediterranean, though direct encounters remained extremely rare due to his supernatural ability to detect approaching humans from vast distances. Witnesses described a creature of magnificent proportions, standing nearly 18 hands high with a coat that shifted between pure white and silver, depending on the lighting conditions. His wings, when fully extended, spanned approximately 30 feet from tip to tip, with feathers that appeared to be crafted from polished metal rather than ordinary organic material. The horse's eyes were said to glow within a fire that reflected his divine heritage, while his movements displayed a grace and power that no earthly animal could match. Pegasus's preferred habitats included remote mountain peaks, hidden valleys, and other locations that provided both solitude and access to the celestial realm that represented his true home. The creature's feeding habits remained mysterious, as he was never observed grazing in the manner of ordinary horses, leading some scholars to theorize that he sustained himself through direct absorption of divine essence, rather than conventional nutrition. His drinking habits, however, had been documented with greater precision, as the horse showed a marked preference for springs that possessed sacred or magical properties. The most famous of these sacred water sources was the Perrine Spring, located on the Acra Corinth above the city of Corinth, where Pegasus was known to appear regularly during specific astronomical conditions. The spring itself occupied a natural grotto carved into the limestone bedrock of the mountain, with crystal clear water emerging from underground sources that were believed to connect directly to the realm of the nymphs. The water's exceptional purity and its association with poetic inspiration had made Perrine a pilgrimage destination for artists, musicians, and writers who sought divine blessing for their creative endeavours. The religious significance of the Perrine Spring extended far beyond its connection to Pegasus, encompassing a complex web of mythological associations that linked it to various aspects of divine creativity and inspiration. The spring was sacred to the Muses, the 9 daughters of Zeus who presided over different forms of artistic expression, and poets traditionally made offerings at its banks before beginning major works. The water itself was believed to possess transformative properties, granting enhanced creative abilities to those who drank from it with proper reverence and pure intentions. Local religious traditions maintained that the spring had been created when Pegasus struck the ground with his hoof during his first landing on the Acra Corinth, causing the sacred water to burst forth from the previously dry rock. This origin myth established a permanent connection between the winged horse and the spring, suggesting that his periodic returns to drink from its waters represented not mere physical necessity, but spiritual renewal through contact with the divine forces that had shaped his creation. The timing of Pegasus's appearances at Perrine followed patterns that corresponded to specific astronomical events, particularly the heliacal rising of certain constellations that were associated with his divine parentage. These appearances typically occurred during the pre-dawn hours when the boundary between night and day created optimal conditions for interaction between the mortal and divine realms. The horse's approach was invariably preceded by supernatural phenomena, including unusual cloud formations, unexplained lights in the sky, and the sudden silence of all natural sounds in the surrounding area. Bellerophon's journey from Lycia to Corinth required careful planning to ensure that he would arrive at the Perrine Spring during the appropriate astronomical conditions for Pegasus's next predicted appearance. The prince's calculations were based on information gathered from local priests and astronomers who maintained detailed records of celestial events and their correlation with supernatural manifestations. The journey itself would take approximately 2 weeks, allowing sufficient time for the complex preparations that would be necessary for any attempt to capture the legendary winged horse. The overland route from Xanthos to the coast involved traversing mountainous terrain where local populations had developed sophisticated knowledge of Pegasus's movements and behaviour patterns. These highland communities, primarily composed of shepherds and hunters who spent their lives in remote areas, had accumulated generations of observations regarding the winged horse's habits and preferences. Their information proved invaluable for understanding the creature's psychology and developing strategies that might prove effective in approaching him without triggering his supernatural ability to detect and avoid potential threats. The maritime portion of the journey presented its own challenges, as Bellerophon needed to secure passage on vessels whose captains possessed both the skill necessary to navigate treacherous Aegean waters and the discretion required to avoid attracting unwanted attention to his mission. The prince's royal status provided him with access to high-quality transportation, while his reputation as a hero undertaking divine missions ensured respectful treatment from ship crews who recognized the potential honor associated with assisting such an enterprise. The approach to Corinth from the sea offered Bellerophon his first view of the Acra Corinth in over a year. the massive limestone peak rising dramatically from the narrow isthmus that connected the Peloponnese to mainland Greece. The mountain's strategic importance was immediately apparent, as its elevation provided commanding views over both the Saronic and Corinthian gulfs, while its steep slopes offered natural defensive advantages that had made it virtually impregnable throughout recorded history. The sight of his homeland's most distinctive landmark stirred complex emotions in the exiled prince, combining nostalgia for his former life with apprehension about the dangerous task that had brought him back to familiar territory. The city of Corinth itself had changed little during Bellerophon's absence, with the same bustling commercial districts, crowded harbours, and impressive public buildings that had characterised it during his youth. However, his status as an exile prevented him from entering the city proper, or seeking assistance from former allies, who might have aided his mission. Instead, he was forced to rely on contacts among the merchant communities and foreign residents who maintained less rigid adherence to the political restrictions that governed interactions with exiled royalty. The climb to the Perenn Spring required several hours of difficult hiking along ancient paths that wound through olive groves and rocky outcroppings where wild herbs grew in abundance. These plants, many of which possessed medicinal or magical properties, had been gathered by local wise women and religious practitioners for centuries, creating a complex ecosystem where human activity and natural processes had achieved remarkable balance. The spring itself occupied a secluded grotto, approximately halfway up the mountain, positioned where natural rock formations provided both shelter and concealment from casual observation. The physical characteristics of the Perenn Spring exceeded even the elaborate descriptions that Bellerophon had heard during his youth in Corinth. The grotto's entrance was framed by limestone formations that had been carved by centuries of water flow into shapes that resembled architectural columns, while the interior walls were decorated with natural mineral deposits that gleamed like precious metals in the filtered sunlight. The spring itself emerged from a fissure in the back wall of the grotto, creating a pool of crystal-clear water that remained at constant temperature regardless of seasonal weather conditions. The water's exceptional purity was immediately apparent to anyone who observed it, as the liquid was so clear that the bottom of the pool remained visible despite depths that exceeded 10 feet in some areas. The surface remained perfectly still except for the gentle ripples created by the spring's continuous flow, creating mirror-like reflections that seemed to capture and hold images with supernatural clarity. Local traditions maintained that these reflections could sometimes reveal prophetic visions to those who possessed the spiritual sensitivity necessary to interpret their symbolic content. The religious atmosphere surrounding the spring was enhanced by numerous votive offerings that pilgrims had left over the centuries, including small bronze figurines, carved stone tablets inscribed with prayers, and wreaths of flowers that somehow remained fresh despite their obvious age. These offerings created a tangible sense of sacred presence that affected even casual visitors, while their variety and quality demonstrated the spring's reputation throughout the Greek world as a site where divine intervention was both possible and probable. Bellerophon's preparations for his encounter with Pegasus involved both practical arrangements for capturing the winged horse and spiritual preparations designed to ensure divine favour for his enterprise. The practical aspects included the construction of a carefully concealed shelter, where he could wait for extended periods without being detected by the horse's supernatural senses, along with the procurement of supplies necessary for what might prove to be a lengthy vigil. The shelter itself was built from local materials using techniques that minimized human scent and visual impact, creating a hiding place that would blend seamlessly with the natural environment. The spiritual preparations required more complex considerations, as success would depend heavily on maintaining proper relationships with the various deities who possessed interests in the outcome of his mission. Athena's gift of the golden bridle represented her direct involvement in the enterprise, but Pegasus's parentage through Poseidon meant that the sea god's approval would also be crucial for any attempt to approach his divine offspring. Additionally, the sacred nature of the Pyrene spring required appropriate respect for the nymphs and muses who were associated with the site. The offerings that Bellerophon prepared for these various divine powers reflected both traditional religious requirements and the specific circumstances of his mission. For Athena, he selected items that emphasized wisdom and strategic thinking, including an owl carved from ivory and a small bronze shield decorated with scenes depicting the goddess's various attributes. For Poseidon, he chose offerings that acknowledged the god's dominion over horses in the sea, including a miniature trident crafted from silver and a collection of rare seashells gathered from beaches throughout the Mediterranean. The astronomical conditions that governed Pegasus's appearances at the spring were approaching their optimal configuration when Bellerophon completed his preparations and began his vigil in the concealed shelter. The relevant celestial events included the conjunction of specific planets with constellations that were associated with divine horses, along with lunar phases that enhanced the boundary between mortal and immortal realms. These conditions occurred relatively infrequently, making timing crucial for any attempt to encounter the winged horse at his preferred drinking location. The first night of Bellerophon's vigil passed without incident, though the supernatural atmosphere of the spring created numerous false alarms as natural sounds and movements took on potentially significant meanings in the heightened tension of expectation. The prince's military training proved valuable in maintaining alertness throughout the long hours of darkness, while his recent experience with divine communication helped him distinguish between ordinary environmental phenomena and genuinely supernatural manifestations that might indicate Pegasus's approach. The second night brought more promising signs, including the appearance of unusual cloud formations that seemed to spiral around the peak of the Acrocorinth in patterns that defied normal meteorological explanation. The temperature around the spring dropped noticeably despite the season's warmth, while the water itself began to emit a faint phosphorescent glow that had never been reported in previous observations. These phenomena suggested that the boundary between realms was beginning to weaken in preparation for the winged horse's manifestation. The actual arrival of Pegasus occurred during the darkest hour before dawn on the third night, when the constellation Perseus reached its zenith and the moon entered its new phase. The first indication of the horse's presence was the sudden cessation of all natural sounds in the area, as insects, night birds, and small mammals fell silent in response to the approaching divine presence. This unnatural quiet was followed by a gradual brightening of the sky that had no apparent source, as though starlight itself was being concentrated and focused on the grotto containing the sacred spring. The winged horse's descent from the heavens was a spectacle that exceeded even Bellerophon's heightened expectations, as Pegasus appeared first as a distant point of silver light that gradually resolved into recognizable equine form as he approached the mountain. His wings moved with slow, powerful strokes that generated no sound despite their enormous size, while his hooves seemed to strike invisible surfaces in the air that supported his weight as effectively as solid ground. The creature's coat gleamed within a radiance that illuminated the surrounding landscape, transforming the familiar terrain into something approaching the divine realm itself. The psychological impact of witnessing Pegasus's approach tested Bellerophon's courage and determination to their limits, as the horse's supernatural nature created an almost overwhelming sense of awe that made normal thought and action extremely difficult. The creature's eyes, burning with divine fire, seemed to perceive everything within miles of his location, while his bearing conveyed both magnificent beauty and terrible power that reminded observers of his dual nature as offspring of both god and monster. Only the prince's firm grip on Athena's golden bridle and his desperate need to complete his mission prevented him from abandoning his hiding place and fleeing in terror. Pegasus's drinking ritual at the Perrine Spring followed patterns that reflected both his divine nature and his connection to the sacred properties of the water itself. The horse approached the pool with ceremonial deliberation, lowering his magnificent head to touch the surface with his muzzle before beginning to drink. The water seemed to respond to his presence by glowing more brightly, while the surrounding air filled with harmonious sounds that suggested the presence of invisible choirs celebrating the reunion between the divine creature and his sacred spring. The moment Bellerophon secured Athena's golden bridle around Pegasus's magnificent head, he felt the immediate transformation of their relationship from hunter and quarry to partners united in divine purpose. The winged horse's initial resistance to mortal contact dissolved as the sacred leather touched his neck, replaced by an understanding that transcended normal animal-human communication. Pegasus's eyes, still burning with their supernatural fire, now reflected recognition of the prince's legitimate authority as bearer of the goddess's gift, while his powerful muscles relaxed beneath Bellerophon's tentative touch. The prince's first flight aboard Pegasus revealed capabilities that exceeded even his most optimistic expectations about aerial combat possibilities. The horse's wings generated lift through principles that defied conventional understanding of flight, carrying both rider and mount effortlessly through air currents that would have challenged the largest eagles. The sensation of soaring above the Mediterranean landscape provided Bellerophon with entirely new perspectives on military strategy, as he could observe terrain features, defensive positions, and potential approach routes that remained invisible to ground-based observers. The journey back to Lycia aboard Pegasus required only 2 days compared to the weeks of overland and maritime travel that had brought Bellerophon to Corinth, demonstrating the tremendous strategic advantages that aerial mobility would provide in his confrontation with the Chimera. The winged horse's supernatural endurance eliminated the need for frequent rest stops, while his ability to navigate by celestial markers that were invisible to mortal eyes ensured direct routing that avoided the geographical obstacles and political complications that affected conventional travel. The Chimera's lair occupied a volcanic crater in the mountainous interior of Lycia, approximately 50 miles northeast of Xanthos, in terrain so rugged that even experienced mountain guides avoided the region except when absolutely necessary. The crater itself was the remnant of an ancient eruption that had occurred centuries before recorded history, creating a circular depression nearly 2 miles in diameter surrounded by jagged peaks that rose over 3,000 feet above the surrounding valleys. The geological violence that had created this formation had left behind a landscape of twisted rock formations, unstable scree slopes, and hidden crevasses that made ground-based approach extremely hazardous. The monster's choice of this location as its primary residence reflected both practical and supernatural considerations that demonstrated intelligence far exceeding that of ordinary predatory animals. The crater's natural barriers provided protection from large-scale military operations, while offering multiple escape routes through narrow passes that could accommodate a flying creature but would channel pursuing forces into vulnerable positions. The volcanic geology created numerous caves and underground passages where the Chimera could retreat when threatened, while the residual geothermal activity provided the intense heat that the creature required for optimal functioning of its fire-breathing capabilities. The Chimera's physical composition represented one of the most terrifying examples of supernatural hybridization recorded in ancient sources, combining the most dangerous aspects of 3 different predatory species into a single entity that possessed capabilities far exceeding the sum of its individual components. The creature's front portion consisted of a massive lion's head and torso, with jaws that could crush bronze shields and claws capable of tearing through stone fortifications. The lion's mane, described by survivors as appearing to be made of actual flames, provided both intimidating display and practical protection against conventional weapons that might target the neck area. The middle section of the creature took the form of a goat's body, though enlarged to proportions that dwarfed even the largest domestic specimens. This portion provided the Chimera with exceptional agility and climbing ability that allowed it to navigate mountainous terrain with ease, while maintaining the speed necessary to pursue fleeing prey across varied landscapes. The goat body's powerful legs could propel the entire creature in leaps that spanned distances of over 100 feet, while its sure footing on unstable surfaces made it nearly impossible to trap or corner in rocky terrain. The monster's rear portion consisted of a serpent's tail that measured approximately 20 feet in length and possessed both striking capability and venomous fangs that delivered toxins capable of killing a full-grown man within minutes of injection. The serpent tail moved independently of the creature's other sections, allowing it to attack targets from unexpected angles, while the lion head engaged opponents frontally. The tail's scales were reportedly harder than bronze armor, providing protection against edged weapons, while its flexibility allowed it to coil around victims and crush them with bone-breaking force. The supernatural fire that the Chimera breathed represented perhaps its most devastating weapon, as this flame possessed characteristics that violated natural law and rendered conventional defensive strategies useless. Unlike ordinary fire, which required fuel and oxygen to sustain combustion, the monster's flames appeared to burn through direct supernatural energy that could not be extinguished by water, sand, or any other material available to ancient firefighting techniques. The flame's temperature exceeded that of normal fire by such significant margins that they could melt bronze weapons and armor within seconds of contact. The visual characteristics of the Chimera's fire added psychological warfare elements to its already formidable physical capabilities, as the flames burned in colours that had never been observed in natural combustion. Witnesses described fires that shifted between deep crimson, brilliant white, and an eerie blue-green that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light from surrounding sources. These unnatural colours created disorienting effects that made accurate judgment of distance and timing extremely difficult, while their otherworldly appearance induced panic responses, even in experienced warriors who had faced conventional battlefield fires. The range and accuracy of the Chimera's fire-breathing attacks had been documented through bitter experience by the survivors of previous encounters, revealing capabilities that made the creature effective at distances far exceeding those of conventional projectile weapons. The monster could project flames in concentrated streams that maintained lethal intensity at ranges up to 200 feet, while broader dispersal patterns could create walls of fire that blocked retreat routes and prevented coordinated group attacks. The creature's ability to control both the direction and spread of its flames demonstrated intelligence and tactical awareness that elevated it far above the level of mere predatory instinct. The terrorization of Lycia by the Chimera had begun approximately 5 years before Bellerophon's arrival, when the creature first emerged from its volcanic lair to raid settlements in the surrounding valleys. The initial attacks had been dismissed by royal authorities as exaggerated reports from remote farming communities, as the descriptions of a fire-breathing monster seemed too fantastic to warrant serious military attention. This skepticism had allowed the Chimera to establish territorial dominance over an increasingly large area, while developing hunting patterns that maximized its destructive impact on human settlements. The monster's hunting strategy revealed sophisticated understanding of human psychology and social organization, as it deliberately targeted locations and timing that would create maximum terror and disruption among the affected populations. Rather than simply seeking prey for immediate consumption, the Chimera appeared to take pleasure in the fear and chaos that its attacks generated, often destroying property and livestock far beyond its apparent nutritional requirements. This behaviour suggested that the creature possessed motivations that transcended basic survival instincts, possibly including revenge against human civilization for unspecified grievances. The economic impact of the Chimera's depredations had grown progressively more severe as expanding areas fell under its influence, disrupting trade routes and agricultural production throughout the affected regions. Merchant caravans had ceased travelling through mountain passes where the creature might appear, while farming communities had abandoned fertile valleys to seek refuge in more defensible locations. The resulting disruption of commerce and food production had created shortages that affected even areas not directly threatened by the monster, as regional economic networks struggled to adapt to the loss of traditional resources and transportation corridors. The psychological effects of the Chimera's presence extended far beyond the immediate victims of its attacks, as knowledge of the creature's supernatural capabilities spread throughout Lycia and neighbouring kingdoms through refugee accounts and merchant reports. The monster's apparent immunity to conventional military tactics had undermined confidence in royal authority and traditional defensive strategies, while its supernatural nature raised theological questions about divine displeasure and cosmic imbalance that troubled religious authorities throughout the region. King Iobates' previous attempts to destroy the Chimera had involved increasingly desperate measures that reflected both the growing severity of the threat and the failure of conventional military approaches to achieve meaningful results. The first organised expedition had consisted of 200 heavy infantry supported by cavalry units and siege engines, representing a significant portion of the Royal Army's available strength. This force had been annihilated within hours of encountering the monster, with survivors reporting that their bronze weapons and armour had proven useless against the creature's supernatural flames and physical capabilities. Subsequent military efforts had focused on attempting to trap the Chimera using various engineering approaches, including the construction of elaborate pit traps, the deployment of heavy nets designed to entangle flying creatures, and the creation of artificial barriers intended to channel the monster into predetermined killing zones. All of these strategies had failed catastrophically, as the creature's intelligence and supernatural senses allowed it to detect and avoid human-constructed hazards, while its physical capabilities enabled it to destroy or circumvent obstacles that would have contained ordinary animals. The failure of conventional military solutions had led King Iobates to seek assistance from foreign specialists, including monster hunters from distant lands who claimed expertise in dealing with supernatural threats. These individuals, while possessing impressive credentials and elaborate equipment, had proven no more successful than local forces when confronted with the Chimera's unique combination of capabilities. Their failures had served primarily to enhance the monster's reputation for invincibility, while depleting the royal treasury through payments for services that produced no beneficial results. Bellerophon's aerial reconnaissance of the Chimera's territory aboard Pegasus provided him with intelligence that no previous opponent had possessed, revealing both the creature's behavioural patterns and the geographical features that would influence their eventual confrontation. The winged horse's supernatural senses could detect the monster's presence from distances that exceeded normal visual range, while his ability to maintain silent flight allowed extended observation periods without alerting their quarry to surveillance activities. The prince's observations revealed that the Chimera maintained a regular patrol schedule that took it through specific valleys and mountain passes on a rotating basis, apparently designed to maintain territorial dominance while ensuring that no area remained safe for extended human habitation. These patrols typically occurred during daylight hours when the creature's fire-breathing capabilities would be most visible and psychologically effective, though it also conducted nighttime raids when lunar conditions provided optimal hunting light. The monster's physical condition appeared excellent despite its years of constant activity, with no visible signs of injury, illness, or aging that might provide tactical advantages for a potential opponent. The creature's movements displayed the fluid coordination between its disparate body parts that indicated perfect health and optimal functioning of its supernatural physiology. This observation confirmed that any successful attack would need to overcome the Chimera at full strength, rather than exploit existing weaknesses or vulnerabilities. The tactical advantages provided by aerial combat became apparent as Bellerophon analysed the limitations that ground-based positioning imposed on previous attackers. The Chimera's fire-breathing capabilities were most effective against targets at the same elevation or below its position, as the creature could use gravity to extend the range and accuracy of its flame attacks. Ground-based opponents were also vulnerable to the monster's charging attacks, as its massive size and speed could generate tremendous kinetic energy when focused on stationary or slowly moving targets. Aerial positioning would allow Bellerophon to attack from angles that the Chimera had never needed to defend against, as no previous opponent had possessed the capability to engage from above. The creature's neck and back areas, which were protected from frontal assault by its fearsome head and from ground-level attacks by its elevated position, would become accessible to properly positioned aerial strikes. Additionally, the psychological impact of being attacked from an unexpected direction might disrupt the monster's tactical coordination and reduce the effectiveness of its integrated defensive systems. The development of specific combat tactics for the aerial engagement required careful consideration of both Pegasus's capabilities and the weapons available for mounted combat at extreme altitudes. Traditional cavalry weapons such as swords and spears were designed for ground-level encounters where gravity assisted downward strikes, while their effectiveness at aerial combat ranges remained untested. The prince's selection of primary weapons focused on projectiles that could be accurately delivered from flying platforms, particularly javelins whose aerodynamic properties would be enhanced rather than hindered by the additional altitude. The lead-tipped spear that would prove crucial to the Chimera's defeat represented an innovative solution to the specific challenges posed by the monster's fire-breathing capabilities. Bellerophon's analysis of previous encounter reports had identified the creature's flame attacks as its primary defensive mechanism, capable of destroying conventional weapons before they could inflict significant damage. The use of lead as a spear-tip material was inspired by the metal's unique properties when exposed to extreme heat, as lead would melt and expand rather than simply burning away like organic materials or becoming brittle like other metals. The tactical theory behind the lead-tipped spear involved exploiting the Chimera's own fire-breathing reflex to transform a conventional projectile into a more effective weapon. When the monster attempted to incinerate an incoming spear with its supernatural flames, the lead tip would melt and expand into a molten mass that would be driven deeper into the target by the spear's momentum. The molten lead would then cool and solidify within the wound, creating internal damage that would be far more severe than that inflicted by conventional spear points that might be deflected by the creature's supernatural hide. The construction of the specialized weapon required careful attention to balancing requirements, as the lead tip needed to be heavy enough to provide the desired melting effect, while remaining light enough to allow accurate throwing from aerial positions. The spear shaft was crafted from ash wood that had been seasoned for optimal flexibility and strength, while the lead tip was cast in a mold that provided aerodynamic efficiency during flight. The weapon's overall length was adjusted to accommodate the throwing techniques that would be most effective from Pegasus's back during high-speed aerial maneuvers. The final confrontation between Bellerophon and the Chimera occurred on a clear morning when atmospheric conditions provided optimal visibility and wind patterns that would favour aerial combat tactics. The prince's approach to the monster's lair was timed to coincide with the creature's expected emergence for its morning patrol, ensuring that the battle would take place in open terrain rather than within the confining spaces of the volcanic crater where the Chimera's advantages would be maximised. Pegasus's initial climb to attack altitude demonstrated the tremendous advantages that divine assistance provided over conventional military capabilities, as the winged horse could achieve positions that placed them beyond the effective range of the Chimera's ground-based attacks, while maintaining perfect manoeuvrability for offensive operations. The ascent to 3,000 feet above the crater floor required only minutes, compared to the hours that would have been necessary for ground forces to achieve equivalent tactical positions through mountain climbing. The Chimera's reaction to the appearance of aerial opponents revealed both surprise and adaptive intelligence, as the creature had never previously encountered threats from above and required several moments to assess the new tactical situation. The monster's initial response involved attempting to use its fire-breathing capabilities against the flying targets, but the extreme range and unfavourable angle reduced the effectiveness of its flames to manageable levels that Pegasus could easily avoid through superior manoeuvrability. The aerial combat that followed demonstrated the revolutionary potential of mounted flight in military applications, as Bellerophon could engage and disengage at will, while maintaining positional advantages that were impossible for ground-based opponents to counter. Pegasus's supernatural speed and agility allowed them to attack from multiple directions in rapid succession, preventing the Chimera from establishing effective defensive positions or coordinating counterattacks using its various natural weapons. The decisive moment of the battle came when Bellerophon successfully delivered his lead-tip spear into the Chimera's throat during a precisely timed diving attack that brought them within range despite the creature's defensive flames. The monster's instinctive attempt to incinerate the incoming projectile triggered the tactical sequence that the prince had planned, as the supernatural fire melted the lead tip and drove the molten metal deep into the creature's respiratory system. The resulting internal damage disrupted the Chimera's ability to breathe fire, while causing massive trauma to vital organs that even its supernatural constitution could not overcome. The Chimera's death throes lasted for several minutes, during which the creature's various body sections fought independently against the spreading internal damage caused by the molten lead. The lionhead continued attempting to roar and bite even as its fire-breathing capability failed, while the serpent tail lashed wildly in all directions before finally falling still. The goat body's powerful legs continued kicking for some time after the other sections had ceased movement, demonstrating the independent nervous systems that had made the creature such a formidable opponent. The immediate aftermath of the Chimera's destruction brought visible relief to the surrounding landscape, as the supernatural terror that had dominated the region for years was finally eliminated. Birds that had avoided the area during the monster's reign began appearing within hours of its death, while the oppressive atmosphere of fear that had characterized the volcanic crater was replaced by natural sounds and normal weather patterns. The creature's corpse, despite its supernatural origins, began decomposing according to natural processes, though local authorities would preserve portions as proof of the victory and as materials for religious ceremonies celebrating the restoration of cosmic order. The destruction of the Chimera had barely settled into legend when King Iobates realized that his plan to eliminate Bellerophon through impossible tasks had catastrophically backfired. The prince's triumphant return to Xanthos aboard Pegasus, carrying the monster's severed head as proof of his victory, created a political crisis that threatened to expose the true nature of Proetus's letter and the king's complicity in what amounted to attempted murder through deception. The crowds that gathered to witness Bellerophon's aerial approach to the palace demonstrated a level of popular enthusiasm that made any immediate action against the hero politically impossible, while the obvious divine favour represented by his partnership with the winged horse suggested that further attempts on his life might bring supernatural retribution upon the kingdom. Iobates' advisors, unaware of the secret correspondence that had motivated their king's assignment of the Chimera mission, interpreted Bellerophon's success as validation of their earlier assessments regarding his heroic potential. The military commanders who had witnessed the destruction of entire expeditions by the fire-breathing monster could barely comprehend how a single warrior, regardless of his divine assistance, had accomplished what their combined forces had failed to achieve. The religious authorities proclaimed the victory as evidence of restored cosmic balance, while diplomatic representatives from neighbouring kingdoms began arriving to negotiate alliances with a ruler who commanded such obviously favoured heroes. the Lycian king found himself trapped between his original commitment to his son-in-law Praetus and the practical impossibility of eliminating a hero who had become a symbol of divine justice and royal power. The public celebration of Bellerophon's victory had elevated him to a status where any harm befalling him would inevitably be attributed to royal jealousy or foreign conspiracy, creating political complications that could destabilize the entire kingdom. The economic benefits already emerging from the Chimera's destruction, as trade routes reopened and agricultural production resumed in previously abandoned areas, made the hero's continued presence valuable to the kingdom's prosperity, regardless of personal considerations. The solution that emerged from Iobates' strategic deliberations involved escalating rather than abandoning his campaign against Bellerophon, but with modifications designed to address the changed political circumstances created by the Chimera's defeat. Rather than single impossible tasks that might be overcome through divine intervention and exceptional heroism, the king would assign a series of military campaigns against multiple enemies that would test the limits of even supernatural assistance, while providing legitimate justification for placing the hero in mortal danger. These missions would be framed as essential defensive operations protecting Lycian interests, making refusal appear treasonous while ensuring that failure would result from overwhelming odds rather than obvious royal malice. The first of these expanded challenges involved a campaign against the Solymi, a confederation of mountain tribes whose territories occupied the rugged highlands northeast of the Lycian kingdom. These peoples had maintained their independence for centuries through a combination of geographical advantages, military prowess, and political fragmentation that made them difficult targets for conventional conquest. Their mountain strongholds occupied positions that were virtually impregnable to siege warfare, while their intimate knowledge of local terrain allowed them to conduct guerrilla operations that could devastate invading forces through ambush and harassment tactics. The Solymi warrior culture had evolved specifically to exploit the defensive advantages provided by their mountainous homeland, producing fighters whose capabilities were optimized for combat in terrain that neutralized many of the tactical advantages enjoyed by conventional armies. Their weapons emphasized portability and versatility over the specialized equipment favored by professional military units, with each warrior carrying multiple spears, a curved sword designed for close combat in confined spaces, and a composite bow capable of accurate shooting at the extreme ranges common in mountain warfare. Their armour consisted of reinforced leather and bronze scales that provided protection while maintaining the mobility essential for rapid movement across difficult terrain. The social organisation of Solymi communities reflected the demands of constant warfare and the geographical isolation imposed by their mountain environment. Each tribe maintained strict military hierarchies based on proven combat effectiveness rather than hereditary status, with leadership positions earned through demonstrated success in raids against neighbouring peoples and defence of tribal territories. The confederation structure allowed individual tribes to maintain their autonomy while coordinating military efforts against common enemies, creating a flexible system that could adapt to changing tactical situations while avoiding the internal conflicts that plagued more centralized political organizations. The economic foundation of Solymi society rested primarily on pastoralism and raiding, with limited agricultural production due to the poor soil and harsh climate conditions that characterized their highland territories. The herds of goats and sheep provided basic nutritional requirements, while their intimate knowledge of mountain passes made them invaluable as guides for merchants willing to pay premium rates for access to otherwise inaccessible trade routes. However, the bulk of their material wealth came from raiding expeditions that targeted the prosperous settlements and trade caravans operating in the valleys below their mountain strongholds. The military threat that the Solymi posed to Lycian interests had intensified significantly during the years when the Chimera's depredations had weakened royal authority and disrupted normal defensive operations. The mountain tribes had exploited this period of reduced military pressure to expand their raiding activities establishing permanent bases in territories that had previously been under effective Lycian control. Their increasingly bold attacks on merchant caravans and farming communities had created economic losses that rivaled those caused by the fire-breathing monster, while their apparent immunity from royal retaliation had encouraged other hostile groups to test Lycian defensive capabilities. The strategic challenge presented by the Solemni differed fundamentally from the supernatural threat posed by the Chimera, requiring conventional military solutions that would test Bellerophon's capabilities as a tactical commander, rather than his ability to overcome mythological monsters through divine assistance. The mountain warriors possessed no supernatural abilities that might be countered through magical weapons or divine intervention, but their numerical superiority and geographical advantages created obstacles that could not be overcome through individual heroism, regardless of its exceptional nature. Bellerophon's initial reconnaissance of Solemni territory aboard Pegasus revealed the full scope of the challenge that awaited him, as the Confederation controlled an area of approximately 2,000 square miles of mountainous terrain that included dozens of fortified settlements and an estimated population of over 50,000 inhabitants. The tribal strongholds occupied positions that had been selected and improved over generations to maximize their defensive potential, with natural rock formations supplemented by constructed fortifications that could withstand prolonged siege operations. The interconnected network of these positions created a defensive system where the capture of individual strongholds would not necessarily provide strategic advantages, as neighbouring tribes could continue resistance from their own fortified bases. The logistical complexities of conducting military operations in Solemni territory exceeded those of conventional warfare by significant margins, as the mountainous terrain made it impossible to transport the heavy equipment and supply trains that supported traditional siege operations. The narrow mountain paths could not accommodate wheeled vehicles, while the extreme elevation changes and unstable surfaces made even pack animal transportation extremely hazardous. These limitations meant that any attacking force would be restricted to equipment and supplies that individual soldiers could carry, severely limiting their sustained combat effectiveness and tactical options. The tactical approach that Bellerophon developed for the Solemni campaign exploited the unique advantages provided by aerial mobility, while acknowledging the limitations imposed by fighting an enemy that possessed conventional rather than supernatural capabilities. Pegasus could transport the hero rapidly between widely separated tribal strongholds, allowing him to conduct coordinated attacks that prevented effective communication and mutual support between different Solemni communities. The psychological impact of aerial assault on peoples who had never encountered such tactics could potentially compensate for the numerical disadvantages that ground-based operations would face. The campaign's opening phase involved a series of precision strikes against isolated Solemni outposts that served as early warning systems and communication links for the Confederation's defensive network. These facilities, typically consisting of stone towers built on prominent peaks, were lightly garrisoned but strategically crucial for coordinating tribal responses to external threats. Bellerophon's aerial attacks eliminated these positions with minimal resistance, as their defenders had no experience with aerial combat and lacked weapons capable of engaging flying opponents effectively. The destruction of the communication network created confusion and paranoia among Solemni communities that had previously relied on coordinated intelligence gathering to maintain their security. Individual tribes began withdrawing their forces to defend their own territories rather than supporting Confederation-wide military operations, fragmenting the unified resistance that had made them such formidable opponents for conventional armies. The psychological effect of attacks that seemed to come from nowhere and could not be predicted or prevented using traditional methods created a climate of fear that undermined the warrior culture's confidence in their established tactical doctrines. The main phase of the campaign involved systematic attacks on the largest Solemni strongholds, beginning with those that controlled the most strategically important mountain passes and trade routes. These operations required careful coordination between aerial reconnaissance, precision bombing using rocks and incendiary materials dropped from Pegasus, and ground assault tactics that exploited the confusion created by unexpected aerial attacks. The combination of supernatural mobility and conventional military techniques proved devastatingly effective against opponents who had developed their defensive strategies around purely ground-based threats. The siege of the primary Solimese stronghold at Termessos represented the campaign's most challenging operation, as this fortress occupied a mountain peak that rose over 4,000 feet above sea level and was protected by multiple lines of defensive walls that had been constructed and improved over several centuries. The fortress's garrison included approximately 2,000 of the Confederation's most experienced warriors, while its strategic position controlled access to the region's most important mountain passes. The facility's capture would effectively end organised Solimene resistance, while demonstrating Lycian authority over territories that had been contested for generations. The aerial bombardment of Termessos continued for 3 days, with Bellerophon and Pegasus conducting multiple sorties that targeted defensive positions, supply storage areas, and troop concentrations within the fortress complex. The psychological impact of sustained aerial attack proved as important as the physical damage inflicted, as the Solimene defenders had no effective means of retaliation against an enemy that could strike from any direction while remaining beyond the range of their weapons. The constant threat of death from above prevented normal defensive activities and created panic among warriors who had never experienced their own vulnerability in such absolute terms. The fortress's eventual surrender occurred when its water supply system was destroyed by precisely placed incendiary bombs that collapsed the underground cisterns and aqueducts that had made the mountain stronghold habitable. The engineering expertise required to identify and target these crucial infrastructure components demonstrated Bellerophon's sophisticated understanding of siege warfare principles, while the successful execution of such precision attacks from aerial platforms established new precedents for military operations that would influence tactical thinking throughout the Mediterranean world. The completion of the Solimene campaign within 6 weeks established Bellerophon's reputation as a military commander whose capabilities extended far beyond individual heroic combat to encompass strategic planning and tactical innovation on unprecedented scales. The Confederation's surrender brought over 2,000 square miles of previously hostile territory under effective Lycian control, while the elimination of their raiding activities restored security to trade routes that generated significant revenue for the royal treasury. The campaign's success created political pressure for King Iobates to acknowledge Bellerophon's achievements publicly while privately intensifying his search for challenges that might finally eliminate the increasingly powerful hero. The second major trial assigned to Bellerophon involved a naval campaign against the Amazons, the legendary warrior women whose maritime raids had disrupted shipping throughout the eastern Mediterranean for several generations. These female fighters operated from bases along the southern shores of the Black Sea, where their queendom of Themyscira controlled territories that provided access to the rich trade routes connecting Asia with European markets. Their naval capabilities had evolved to exploit the geographical advantages provided by their coastal positions, while their military culture emphasized mobility and surprise attacks that could overwhelm conventional defensive measures. Amazon society represented one of the most unusual political and military organizations in the ancient world, with women occupying all positions of authority while men served primarily in support roles that were considered essential but subordinate. Their warrior culture had developed sophisticated training programs that produced female fighters whose combat effectiveness rivaled or exceeded that of male warriors from traditional societies, while their social organization eliminated many of the internal conflicts that weakened conventional kingdoms through succession disputes and gender-based political competition. The military capabilities of Amazon forces reflected their maritime orientation and their emphasis on rapid strike operations that could achieve tactical objectives before conventional enemies could organize effective responses. Their ships were designed for speed and maneuverability rather than heavy combat, with shallow drafts that allowed them to operate in coastal waters where larger vessels could not pursue them. Their weapons emphasized archery and light infantry tactics that were optimized for shipboard combat and amphibious operations, while their armor provided protection without sacrificing the mobility that their tactical doctrines required. The economic foundation of Amazon society combined traditional activities such as agriculture and craftsmanship with the profits generated by their naval raiding operations, which had become increasingly sophisticated and lucrative as their military capabilities developed. Their attacks on merchant shipping were conducted with professional efficiency that minimized unnecessary violence while maximizing the value of captured goods and prisoners, creating a sustainable economic model that could support their military activities indefinitely. The wealth generated through these operations funded technological improvements in their naval capabilities while providing resources for territorial expansion along the Black Sea coast. The specific threat that Amazon naval forces posed to Lycian interests involved their increasing penetration into Mediterranean waters that had previously been considered secure from their operations. Recent raids had targeted shipping routes that connected Lycia with important trading partners, while their establishment of temporary bases on islands throughout the Aegean suggested plans for permanent expansion into regions that would directly threaten Lycian commercial interests. The political implications of successful Amazon expansion included the potential for alliance between the warrior women and other hostile groups that might coordinate their efforts against Lycian territories. Bellerophon's aerial reconnaissance of Amazon naval operations revealed tactical capabilities that exceeded previous intelligence estimates, as their fleet included over 200 vessels of various sizes and configurations that were coordinated through sophisticated communication systems. The larger ships carried crews of up to 50 warriors and could operate independently for extended periods, while smaller vessels provided scouting and harassment capabilities that extended the fleet's effective operational range. The coordination between different vessel types demonstrated tactical sophistication that rivaled the naval capabilities of major Mediterranean powers. The challenge of conducting aerial operations against naval targets required significant modifications to the tactical approaches that had proven successful during the Solyma campaign, as ships provided mobile platforms that could maneuver to avoid aerial attacks while possessing defensive capabilities specifically designed to counter airborne threats. Amazon vessels carried specialized equipment, including nets that could entangle flying creatures, catapults that could launch projectiles at aerial targets, and trained archers whose skills included techniques for shooting at rapidly moving airborne opponents. The campaign against Amazon naval forces began with attacks on their supply bases and coastal installations, which provided logistical support for their maritime operations while serving as refuges where damaged vessels could be repaired and crews could rest between raids. These facilities were typically located in protected bays and inlets that could be defended against conventional naval attacks, but their fixed positions made them vulnerable to aerial assault despite their sophisticated defensive preparations. The destruction of Amazon coastal bases required careful timing to maximize the damage inflicted, while minimizing the risks posed by their defensive systems, as these installations were heavily fortified and garrisoned by experienced warriors who had developed specific techniques for combating aerial threats. Bellerophon's attacks were coordinated with tidal conditions and weather patterns that would limit the defenders' visibility and mobility, while the use of incendiary weapons created fires that could spread rapidly through the wooden structures and stored supplies that characterized these facilities. The naval phase of the campaign involved direct attacks on Amazon vessels operating in open waters, where their mobility advantages were offset by the superior speed and maneuverability that Pegasus provided for aerial operations. These engagements required precise timing and positioning to deliver effective attacks against moving targets, while avoiding the defensive measures that Amazon crews had developed specifically to counter aerial threats. The psychological impact of being attacked by a flying opponent proved particularly effective against warriors whose combat experience had been limited to conventional maritime warfare. The climactic battle of the Amazon campaign occurred when Bellerophon encountered the main Amazon fleet, commanded by Queen Hippolyta herself, consisting of over 100 vessels arranged in a defensive formation that maximised their collective firepower, while providing mutual support against aerial attacks. This engagement tested the limits of aerial combat capabilities against opponents who had adapted their tactics specifically to counter-flying threats, while the presence of the Amazon Queen ensured that the battle would determine the outcome of the entire campaign. The defeat of Queen Hippolyta's fleet marked a turning point that resonated far beyond the immediate military victory, as news of the Amazon Queen's death spread rapidly throughout the Black Sea region and fundamentally altered the balance of power among the maritime peoples who had previously operated under her protection. The psychological impact of Bellerophon's aerial victory over warriors who had never been defeated in naval combat created a vacuum of authority that various competing factions immediately sought to exploit, leading to internal conflicts within Amazon society that would prevent coordinated military operations for years to come. The surviving Amazon vessels scattered following their queen's death, with individual captains making independent decisions about whether to continue resistance, seek terms with Lycian authorities, or abandon their traditional territories entirely in search of new bases beyond the reach of aerial retaliation. This fragmentation of what had been a unified naval threat eliminated the coordinated planning and resource sharing that had made Amazon raids so effective, reducing them to isolated piracy that could be countered through conventional maritime patrol operations, rather than requiring continued heroic intervention. King Iobates received reports of the Amazon campaign's success with growing consternation, as each of Bellerophon's victories strengthened the hero's political position, while simultaneously making it more difficult to justify additional dangerous assignments without arousing suspicion about the true motives behind these missions. The economic benefits flowing to Lycia from restored maritime trade routes created powerful constituencies within the kingdom who viewed Bellerophon as essential to continued prosperity, while his growing reputation throughout the Mediterranean world made him a valuable diplomatic asset whose elimination would be noticed and questioned by foreign observers. The king's advisors, still unaware of the secret correspondence that had initiated this series of trials, began expressing concerns about the wisdom of continuing to expose such a valuable military commander to unnecessary risks through solo campaigns against dangerous enemies. The strategic advantages that Bellerophon's aerial capabilities provided to Lycian military operations were becoming increasingly apparent as regional threats adapted their tactics to account for the possibility of aerial reconnaissance and attack, making his continued availability crucial for maintaining the kingdom's defensive superiority over potential rivals. The third major trial that Iobates devised for Bellerophon involved a campaign against the Carian pirates, who operated from hidden bases among the numerous islands and secluded coves that characterized the complex coastline between Lycia and the major Greek trading centres. These maritime raiders had developed sophisticated organizational structures that allowed them to coordinate attacks across vast distances while maintaining the flexibility necessary to avoid retaliation from the naval forces of various Mediterranean powers. Their operations had evolved from simple opportunistic piracy to systematic economic warfare that threatened the stability of international commerce throughout the region. The Carian Pirate Confederation consisted of approximately 30 independent crews operating vessels, ranging from small coastal raiders to large warships capable of challenging conventional naval forces in direct combat. Their leadership structure combined democratic elements, where crew members participated in tactical decisions with autocratic authority vested in captains whose positions were maintained through demonstrated success in profitable operations. This hybrid system created highly motivated fighting forces while ensuring that strategic coordination could be achieved when circumstances required unified action against common enemies. The geographical advantages exploited by carrion pirates included intimate knowledge of coastal waters that contained numerous hidden harbours, underwater obstacles that could destroy pursuing vessels, and complex tidal patterns that could be used to facilitate escape from superior forces. Their bases were typically established in locations that were inaccessible to conventional naval operations, while providing rapid access to major shipping routes, allowing them to maintain constant surveillance of potential targets while remaining beyond the reach of retaliation from merchant vessels or naval patrols. The economic model that sustained carrion piracy involved careful analysis of trade patterns and cargo values that maximised the profitability of their operations while minimising the political consequences that might result from attacks on vessels belonging to powerful states or influential merchants. Their intelligence networks included informants in major ports who provided advance information about valuable shipments, while their operational planning incorporated detailed assessments of the defensive capabilities and political connections of potential targets. The military capabilities of carrion pirate forces reflected their specialization in maritime combat and their need to achieve rapid victories against opponents who might summon assistance from nearby naval bases or allied vessels. Their ships were optimized for speed and maneuverability rather than heavy combat, with reinforced rams that could disable larger vessels through precisely delivered impacts, and catapults that could launch incendiary projectiles to create fires that would force enemy crews to abandon their positions. The weapons and tactics employed by carrion pirates emphasized boarding operations that could quickly overwhelm merchant crews while minimizing damage to valuable cargo that represented the primary objective of their attacks. Their fighters carried an assortment of weapons, including curved swords designed for close combat in confined spaces, grappling hooks that could secure enemy vessels for boarding operations, and specialized equipment for cutting rigging and disabling steering mechanisms that might allow targets to escape. Bellerophon's initial reconnaissance of carrion pirate operations revealed a level of organization and tactical sophistication that exceeded previous intelligence estimates, as the Confederation had developed communication systems that allowed rapid coordination between widely separated crews while maintaining operational security that prevented infiltration by hostile agents. Their primary base occupied a fortified island approximately 50 miles southwest of the Lycian coast, where natural harbours provided protection for their fleet, while elevated positions offered commanding views of surrounding waters. The island fortress that served as the Confederation's headquarters had been developed over several decades into a virtually impregnable stronghold that combined natural defensive advantages with constructed fortifications designed specifically to counter naval assault. The harbour entrances were protected by underwater obstacles and concealed catapult positions that could destroy attacking vessels before they could reach the docks, while the elevated fortress complex included storage facilities for captured goods, workshops for maintaining and upgrading vessels, and residential quarters for the permanent population that supported pirate operations. The challenge of conducting aerial operations against maritime targets that possessed both mobility and sophisticated defensive systems required significant tactical innovations that built upon the lessons learned during previous campaigns while adapting to the unique characteristics of naval combat. The carrion pirates had studied reports of Bellerophon's earlier victories and had developed specific countermeasures designed to neutralize the advantages provided by aerial attack, including specialized anti-aircraft weapons and tactical formations that maximize their collective defensive capabilities. The opening phase of the campaign against carrion pirates focused on disrupting their intelligence networks and supply lines, which were essential for maintaining the coordination and logistical support that made their operations profitable. Bellerophon's attacks targeted coastal installations where pirate agents gathered information about merchant shipping, as well as hidden supply depots that provided food, water, and equipment for extended maritime operations. These precision strikes created uncertainty and paranoia within the pirate organization, while forcing them to adopt more defensive postures that reduced their offensive capabilities. The destruction of pirate communication systems involved attacks on signal stations and messenger routes that had been established to coordinate activities between different crews and provide early warning of approaching threats. These facilities were typically located on prominent headlands and small islands that provided optimal visibility for optical signaling systems, but their exposed positions made them vulnerable to aerial assault despite their defensive preparations. The elimination of these communication links forced individual pirate crews to operate independently, reducing their collective effectiveness while making them more predictable targets for subsequent attacks. The main phase of the anti-piracy campaign involved direct attacks on carrion vessels operating in open waters, where their mobility advantages were countered by Pegasus's superior speed and the tactical flexibility provided by aerial positioning. These engagements required careful timing and precise execution, as pirate crews had developed specific techniques for defending against aerial attacks, including the use of nets, coordinated archery, and rapid maneuvering designed to make accurate targeting extremely difficult. The naval combat tactics that proved most effective against carrion pirates involved combination attacks that exploited multiple vulnerabilities simultaneously while preventing coordinated defensive responses. Bellerophon would typically begin engagements with high-altitude bombing runs that used incendiary materials to create fires on enemy vessels, forcing crews to focus on damage control rather than defensive operations. Follow-up attacks with javelins and arrows targeted specific crew members whose roles were essential for ship operations, particularly helmsmen and officers whose elimination would disrupt tactical coordination. The psychological warfare aspects of the anti-piracy campaign proved as important as direct military action, as the constant threat of aerial attack created stress and uncertainty that undermined the confidence and morale that were essential for successful pirate operations. Crews that had previously operated with impunity found themselves constantly scanning the skies for threats that could appear without warning, while the knowledge that their bases and supply lines were vulnerable to attack forced them to adopt increasingly defensive postures that reduced their operational effectiveness. The siege of the main pirate stronghold represented the campaign's most complex operation, as the island fortress possessed defensive systems that had been specifically designed to counter aerial attacks based on intelligence gathered from previous Bellerophon campaigns. The fortification included covered positions that protected defenders from aerial bombardment, specialized catapults that could engage flying targets, and underground facilities that could shelter the garrison during sustained aerial assault. The fortress's defensive preparations reflected sophisticated understanding of aerial combat limitations, particularly the challenges associated with maintaining accurate targeting while maneuvering at high speeds in unpredictable wind conditions. The defenders had constructed multiple false targets designed to waste ammunition and reveal attack patterns, while their genuine defensive positions were camouflaged and protected in ways that made them extremely difficult to identify and engage from aerial platforms. The breakthrough that enabled Bellerophon to overcome these defensive innovations came through his recognition that the fortress's water supply system represented a vulnerability that could not be adequately protected against aerial attack. The island's fresh water came from underground springs that were accessed through wells and cisterns located throughout the fortress complex, but the distribution system required exposed aqueducts and storage tanks that could be targeted despite the defensive measures protecting other facilities. The systematic destruction of the fortress's water infrastructure created conditions that made continued resistance impossible, as the garrison could not survive extended siege operations without reliable access to fresh water. The psychological impact of watching their essential life support systems being methodically destroyed by an opponent they could not effectively engage created panic and desperation that led to the breakdown of military discipline and the eventual surrender of the entire pirate confederation. The completion of the anti-piracy campaign eliminated the last major maritime threat to Lycian commercial interests, while establishing Bellerophon's reputation as a naval commander whose capabilities extended beyond an individual heroic combat to encompass complex strategic operations against sophisticated opponents. The restoration of maritime security throughout the region generated substantial increases in trade revenue that benefited the entire kingdom, while the elimination of pirate bases provided safe harbours for Lycian vessels operating in previously dangerous waters. King Olympus found himself in an increasingly impossible position as Bellerophon's continued successes made it politically and economically disadvantageous to continue assigning dangerous missions that might result in the hero's death. The popular enthusiasm generated by each victory had transformed Bellerophon into a folk hero whose elimination would create serious internal political problems, while his growing international reputation made him a valuable diplomatic asset whose services were being requested by rulers throughout the Mediterranean world. The king's private consultations with his most trusted advisors reveal the depth of his dilemma, as the original motivation for eliminating Bellerophon remained valid, while the practical obstacles to achieving this objective had become virtually insurmountable through conventional means. The hero's divine protection, demonstrated through his partnership with Pegasus and his consistent success in impossible situations, suggested that direct action against him might bring supernatural retribution upon the kingdom and its ruler. The solution that emerged from these deliberations involved a final test that would either eliminate Bellerophon through overwhelming odds, or provide definitive proof of his divine favour that would require a fundamental reassessment of the entire situation. This ultimate trial would take the form of an ambush by the most elite warriors available to the Lycian military, conducted under circumstances that would appear to result from external threats rather than royal conspiracy. The succession of impossible victories over the Chimera, Solymi warriors, Amazons and Carian pirates had fundamentally transformed Bellerophon's understanding of his own capabilities and divine favour. Each triumph aboard Pegasus had reinforced his growing conviction that the gods, particularly Athena, had elevated him above the limitations that constrained ordinary mortals. The golden bridle that had enabled his partnership with the winged horse served as tangible proof of divine approval, while his consistent success in situations where conventional heroes had failed suggested that he occupied a unique position in the cosmic order that governed relationships between mortals and immortals. The psychological effects of sustained heroic achievement created subtle but profound changes in Bellerophon's character that were initially masked by the practical demands of completing his assigned missions. The prince who had once approached divine assistance with humble prayers and careful observance of religious protocols gradually developed an attitude of expectation regarding supernatural support, viewing his victories as confirmation of his special status rather than gifts that required continued gratitude and proper behaviour. This shift in perspective reflected a common pattern in heroic psychology, where exceptional success could lead to the dangerous assumption that divine favour was permanent and unconditional. The transformation of Bellerophon's relationship with divine authority became most apparent in his interactions with mortal rulers and religious officials, who increasingly treated him as a figure whose achievements placed him beyond normal social and political constraints. King Iobates, despite his secret hostility, was forced to acknowledge publicly that the hero's services had brought unprecedented prosperity and security to Lycia, while foreign ambassadors sought audiences to negotiate for his assistance with their own military challenges. This elevation in status created an environment where criticism or contradiction became increasingly rare, depriving Bellerophon of the feedback mechanisms that might have moderated his growing sense of superiority. The partnership with Pegasus contributed significantly to the development of Bellerophon's hubris, as the daily experience of soaring through the heavens provided a literal elevation above earthly concerns that reinforced his psychological separation from ordinary human limitations. The sensation of flight, combined with the godlike perspective it provided over landscapes and human settlements, created a sense of transcendence that made terrestrial authority and conventional wisdom appear increasingly irrelevant. The winged horse's supernatural capabilities had made previously impossible achievements routine, leading Bellerophon to assume that no challenge existed that could not be overcome through divine assistance and heroic determination. The specific incident that triggered Bellerophon's fatal decision to attempt reaching Mount Olympus occurred during a festival celebrating his victories over the various enemies that had threatened Lycian security. The elaborate ceremonies, attended by representatives from throughout the Mediterranean world, featured speeches praising his achievements in terms that compared him favourably to the greatest heroes of previous generations. Several orators, carried away by their rhetorical enthusiasm, suggested that his accomplishments rivaled those of the gods themselves, while others speculated that his divine parentage through Poseidon entitled him to a place among the immortals. These flattering comparisons, while intended as conventional hyperbole appropriate to ceremonial occasions, resonated with Bellerophon's existing inclinations toward grandiosity in ways that proved psychologically decisive. The prince had already begun to question why his exceptional abilities and divine favour should be limited to serving mortal rulers and addressing terrestrial problems, when his partnership with Pegasus provided him with the means to transcend such limitations entirely. The festival's acclaim reinforced his growing conviction that his true destiny lay not in continued service to earthly kingdoms, but in claiming his rightful place among the gods who had made his achievements possible. The theological framework that Bellerophon constructed to justify his intended flight to Olympus revealed sophisticated understanding of Greek religious concepts, combined with dangerous misinterpretation of his own relationship to divine authority. He reasoned that his consistent success in impossible situations demonstrated that the gods viewed him as more than merely a favoured mortal, while his ability to command Pegasus suggested that he possessed inherent divine qualities that had been awakened through his heroic trials. The golden bridle, as a direct gift from Athena, seemed to provide tangible evidence that the goddess intended him to transcend normal human limitations and join the community of immortal beings who governed cosmic order. The hero's analysis of precedents for mortal ascension to divine status focused selectively on examples that supported his desired conclusion, while ignoring the crucial differences between his situation and those of the few individuals who'd successfully achieved immortality. He cited cases such as Heracles, whose labours had earned him a place on Olympus, and Ganymede, who had been elevated to serve as Zeus's cupbearer, without acknowledging that these transformations had occurred through explicit divine invitation rather than mortal initiative. His reasoning failed to recognise that attempting to force divine acceptance through unauthorized action represented the precise kind of presumption that the gods punished most severely. The practical preparations for the flight to Olympus required careful consideration of the logistical challenges involved in reaching the divine realm, which was understood to exist at altitudes far exceeding those achieved during conventional aerial operations. Bellerophon's previous flights with Pegasus had demonstrated that the winged horse could ascend to heights that rendered earthly landmarks invisible, but the journey to Olympus would require sustained flight at altitudes where atmospheric conditions might prove challenging even for a supernatural creature. The hero's confidence in Pegasus's capabilities led him to assume that such technical difficulties could be overcome through determination and divine favour. The timing selected for the attempt reflected Bellerophon's understanding of astronomical conditions that were believed to facilitate communication between mortal and divine realms, particularly the alignment of specific constellations that were associated with heroic achievement and divine recognition. These celestial configurations occurred relatively infrequently, creating a sense of urgency that reinforced his conviction that the gods were providing him with an optimal opportunity to present himself for acceptance into their community. The hero's interpretation of these natural phenomena as divine signals demonstrated the way that hubris could transform neutral events into apparent confirmations of predetermined destiny. The actual flight began at dawn from the summit of Mount Cragus, the highest peak in Lycia, where Bellerophon had established a temporary camp to serve as his launching point for the journey to Olympus. The mountain's elevation provided a strategic advantage by reducing the total distance that would need to be covered at extreme altitude, while its isolation ensured that the attempt would not be observed by witnesses who might interfere with or document the proceedings. The hero's final preparations included offerings to various deities whose favour he believed essential for success, though his prayers had acquired a tone of expectation rather than humble supplication that reflected his transformed understanding of his relationship with divine authority. Pegasus's initial response to Bellerophon's commands for extreme altitude flight suggested that the winged horse possessed instinctive understanding of the dangers associated with unauthorized approaches to the divine realm. The creature's reluctance to ascend beyond the altitudes that had characterized their previous flights manifested as increasingly erratic behavior that required forceful application of the golden bridle's controlling influence. This resistance, which should have served as a warning about the inappropriateness of the intended journey, was instead interpreted by Bellerophon as evidence that even his divine mount needed encouragement to achieve the extraordinary feat that would establish their joint claim to immortal status. The ascent through the upper atmosphere revealed environmental conditions that exceeded anything encountered during previous aerial operations, as the air became increasingly thin and cold, while winds of supernatural intensity threatened to tear both rider and mount from their intended course. The physical stress of operating at such extreme altitudes created challenges that tested the limits of even Pegasus's supernatural endurance, while the psychological pressure of attempting to reach a destination that existed beyond normal spatial relationships created disorientation that made navigation increasingly difficult. The critical moment of divine intervention occurred when Bellerophon and Pegasus reached altitudes that approached the boundary between the mortal world and the divine realm of Olympus. Zeus, whose omniscience encompassed all events occurring within his cosmic domain, became aware of the unauthorized attempt to breach the barriers that separated mortal and immortal realms. The supreme deity's response to this presumptuous invasion reflected his fundamental responsibility for maintaining the cosmic order that assigned specific roles and limitations to different categories of beings. The theological significance of Zeus's intervention extended beyond simple punishment for individual transgression to encompass broader principles regarding the relationship between divine authority and mortal ambition. The king of the gods had established clear boundaries between mortal and immortal realms, not through arbitrary preference, but as essential elements of cosmic stability that prevented chaos and maintained the hierarchical structure necessary for universal order. Bellerophon's attempt to transcend these boundaries without divine authorization represented a direct challenge to the fundamental principles that governed reality itself. The specific method chosen by Zeus for stopping Bellerophon's unauthorized flight demonstrated the god's preference for indirect intervention that would teach appropriate lessons while avoiding the appearance of excessive cruelty toward a hero who had previously served divine purposes effectively. Rather than destroying both rider and mount through direct application of divine power, Zeus selected a more subtle approach that would separate them while providing clear demonstration of the consequences that resulted from presumptuous behavior toward immortal authority. The gadfly that Zeus sent to torment Pegasus represented a carefully chosen instrument of divine justice that exploited the natural behavioral patterns of horses while creating circumstances that would inevitably result in Bellerophon's fall from divine grace. Gadflies were known throughout the Mediterranean world for their ability to drive even the most disciplined animals into frenzied panic through their persistent stinging attacks, making them ideal agents for creating the specific type of uncontrollable behaviour that would serve Zeus's purposes. The supernatural enhancement of this ordinary insect's capabilities ensured that even Pegasus's divine nature could not protect him from its maddening influence. The attack of Zeus's gadfly created immediate chaos that transformed the controlled ascent toward Olympus into a desperate struggle for survival at altitudes where any loss of control would prove fatal. Pegasus's divine composure, which had remained steady throughout their previous adventures against monsters and human enemies, shattered under the insect's supernatural assault as instinctive equine panic responses overrode his rational understanding of the dangers posed by erratic flight behaviour at extreme altitude. The winged horse's violent bucking and rolling movements, which might have been manageable at lower elevations, created gravitational forces that exceeded even Bellerophon's exceptional riding skills. The golden bridle, which had previously provided absolute control over Pegasus's movements and responses, proved inadequate for managing a creature that was experiencing supernaturally induced panic beyond the scope of normal animal behaviour. Bellerophon's desperate attempts to regain control through conventional riding techniques and divine commands failed to overcome the gadfly's maddening influence. While the extreme altitude and violent manoeuvring made it impossible to implement alternative strategies that might have restored stability to their flight, the hero's realization that his divine equipment could not protect him from Zeus's intervention marked the beginning of his understanding that he'd committed a fundamental error in challenging immortal authority. The moment of separation between Bellerophon and Pegasus occurred when the winged horse executed a particularly violent maneuver designed to dislodge the tormenting gadfly, creating forces that exceeded the physical limits of even the golden bridle's supernatural bonding capabilities. The hero found himself torn from his mount's back and plummeting toward the earth from altitudes that made survival impossible through conventional means, while Pegasus, freed from his rider's controlling influence, fled toward distant mountains where he could escape the gadfly's continued assault. The fall from such extreme height provided Bellerophon with extended time to contemplate the magnitude of his error and the inevitable consequences of his presumptuous challenge to divine authority. The physical sensation of uncontrolled descent through increasingly dense atmosphere was accompanied by psychological recognition that his hubris had destroyed not only his own prospects for continued heroic achievement, but also his partnership with the divine creature that had made his greatest victories possible. The hero's final moments of consciousness during the fall were dominated by understanding that his attempt to transcend mortal limitations had instead resulted in his reduction to the most helpless possible human condition. Zeus's intervention in Bellerophon's fall prevented immediate death while ensuring that the hero would survive to experience the full consequences of his presumptuous behaviour toward divine authority. The god's modification of the fall's trajectory directed the hero toward a region of soft marshland that would cushion his impact sufficiently to preserve life, while inflicting injuries that would serve as permanent reminders of his transgression. This careful calibration of punishment reflected Zeus's understanding that Bellerophon's fate would serve as an instructive example for other mortals who might be tempted to challenge the boundaries between human and divine realms. The physical injuries that Bellerophon sustained during his divinely modified fall were severe enough to end his career as an active hero, while leaving him capable of continued existence in a diminished state that would demonstrate the consequences of hubris to all who encountered him. The damage to his legs made normal walking impossible, forcing him to rely on crude supports that provided mobility while serving as visible symbols of his fallen status. The injuries to his eyes, while not causing complete blindness, created visual impairments that prevented him from engaging in activities requiring precise coordination or detailed observation. The psychological trauma associated with the loss of Pegasus and the destruction of his heroic capabilities proved even more devastating than his physical injuries, as Bellerophon's entire identity had become centered on his exceptional achievements and divine favor. The hero who had once soared through the heavens, commanding supernatural forces, found himself reduced to a crippled wanderer whose former glory served only to emphasize the magnitude of his current degradation. The contrast between his past triumphs and present helplessness created a psychological burden that made normal social interaction unbearably painful. The social consequences of Bellerophon's fall reflected the complex relationship between heroic achievement and community acceptance in ancient Greek society, where exceptional individuals were simultaneously celebrated and viewed with suspicion regarding their potential threat to established order. The hero's obvious divine punishment created a situation where association with him might bring supernatural retribution upon others, leading to systematic avoidance that transformed him from a celebrated figure into a social pariah whose presence was considered dangerous and unwelcome. The wandering that characterized Bellerophon's remaining years represented both physical necessity and psychological compulsion, as his inability to find acceptance in any established community forced him into constant movement, while his guilt and shame made solitude preferable to the painful reminders of his former status that human contact inevitably provided. The hero's travels took him through regions where his previous victories had brought peace and prosperity, creating cruel ironies as he observed the continued benefits of achievements that he could no longer claim or celebrate. The theological implications of Bellerophon's punishment extended far beyond individual consequences to encompass broader lessons about the proper relationship between mortal ambition and divine authority that would influence Greek religious thought for generations. His fate demonstrated that even the most exceptional human achievements could not justify presumptuous challenges to cosmic order, while the specific nature of his fall illustrated the principle that divine favor was conditional upon continued humility and proper respect for immortal authority. The moral lessons embedded in Bellerophon's story became central elements in Greek tragic tradition, where his fate served as a paradigmatic example of how hubris inevitably led to divine retribution, regardless of previous heroic achievements. The hero's transformation from celebrated champion to despised wanderer illustrated the fragility of human fortune and the dangers associated with allowing success to create false confidence in one's relationship with divine power. His story provided a cautionary tale that emphasized the importance of maintaining proper humility even in the face of extraordinary accomplishments. The ultimate fate of Bellerophon remained shrouded in uncertainty, as various sources provided conflicting accounts of his final years and death. Some traditions maintained that he eventually achieved a form of redemption through sincere repentance and renewed devotion to proper religious observance, while others suggested that his punishment continued until his natural death brought an end to his suffering. The ambiguity surrounding his ultimate destiny reflected the complex nature of divine justice, which could encompass both mercy and retribution, depending on the genuine transformation of the transgressor's character and understanding. The enduring significance of Bellerophon's story in Greek culture extended beyond its function as a cautionary tale to encompass broader themes about the nature of heroism, the relationship between individual achievement and cosmic order, and the ultimate limitations that defined mortal existence regardless of exceptional capabilities or divine favor. His rise and fall provided a complete narrative arc that illustrated both the potential for human greatness and the dangers that accompanied attempts to transcend the boundaries established by divine wisdom. The hero's fate served as a permanent reminder that true greatness required not only exceptional achievement but also the wisdom to recognize and respect the cosmic order that made such achievement possible.